Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to Adventure by Jack London. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 10. A Message from Bauchi. The next day, Sheldon was left all alone. Joan had gone exploring Paris-Soleil and was not to be expected back until the late afternoon. Sheldon was vaguely oppressed by his loneliness, and several heavy squalls during the afternoon brought him frequently onto the veranda, telescope in hand, to scan the sea, anxiously for the whaleboat. Between whiles he scowled over the plantation account books, made rough estimates, added and balanced, and scowled the harder. The loss of the Jessie had hit Miranda severely. Not alone was his capital depleted by the amount of her value, but her earnings were no longer to be reckoned on, and it was her earnings that largely paid the running expenses of the plantation. "Poor old Hughie," he muttered aloud once. "I'm glad you didn't live to see it, old man. What a cropper! What a cropper!" Between squalls, the Flibbertigibbet ran into anchorage, and her skipper, Pete Olson, brother to the Olson of the Jessie, ancient, grizzled, wild-eyed, emaciated by fever, dragged his weary frame up the veranda steps and collapsed in a steamer chair. Whiskey and soda kept him going while he made report and turned in his accounts. "You're rotten with fever," Sheldon said. "Why don't you run down to Sydney for a blow of decent climate?" The old skipper shook his head. "I can't. I've been in the islands too long. I'd die. The fever comes out worse down there." "Kill or cure," Sheldon counseled. "It's straight kill for me. I tried it 3 years ago. The cool weather put me on my back before I landed. They carried me ashore and into hospital. I was unconscious one stretch for 2 weeks. After that, the doctors sent me back to the islands. Said it was the only thing that would save me. Well, I'm still alive, but I'm too soaked with fever. A month in Australia would finish me." "But what are you going to do?" Sheldon queried. "You can't stay here until you die." "That's all that's left to me. I'd like to go back to the old country, but I couldn't stand it. I'll last longer here, and here I'll stay until I peg out. But I wish to God I'd never seen the Solomons, that's all." He declined to sleep ashore, took his orders, and went back on board the cutter. A lurid sunset was blotted out by the heaviest squall of the day, and Sheldon watched the whaleboat arrive in the thick of it. As the spritsail was taken in, and the boat headed onto the beach, he was aware of a distinct hurt at sight of Joan at the steering oar, standing erect and swaying her strength to it as she resisted the pressures that tended to throw the craft broadside in the surf. Her Tahitians leaped out and rushed the boat high up the beach, and she led her bazaar following through the gate of the compound. The first drops of rain were driving like hailstones. The tall coconut palms were bending and writhing in the grip of the wind, while the thick cloud mass of the squall turned the brief tropic twilight abruptly to night. Quite unconsciously, the brooding anxiety of the afternoon slipped from Sheldon, and he felt strangely cheered at the sight of her running up the steps laughing, face flushed, hair flying, her breast heaving from the violence of her late exertions. "Lovely, perfectly lovely Paris-Soleil," she panted. "I shall buy it. I'll write to the commissioner tonight, and the site for the bungalow, I've selected it already, is wonderful. You must come over some day and advise me. You won't mind my staying here until I can get settled. Wasn't that squall beautiful? And I suppose I'm late for dinner. I'll run and get clean and be with you in a minute." And in the brief interval of her absence, he found himself walking about the big living room, and impatiently and with anticipation awaiting her coming. "Do you know, I'm never going to squabble with you again, he announced when they were seated. Squabble, was the retort. It's such a sordid word. It sounds cheap and nasty. I think it's much nicer to quarrel. Call it what you please, but we won't do it any more, will we? He cleared his throat nervously, for her eyes advertised the immediate beginning of hostilities. I beg your pardon, he hurried on. I should have spoken for myself. What I mean is that I refuse to quarrel. You have the most horrible way, without uttering a word, of making me play the fool. Why, I began with the kindest intentions, and here I am now, making nasty remarks, she completed for him. It's the way you have of catching me up, he complained. Why, I never said a word. I was merely sitting here, being sweetly lured on by promises of peace on earth and all the rest of it, when suddenly you began to call me names. Hardly that, I'm sure. Well, you said I was horrible, or that I had a horrible way about me, which is the same thing. I wish my bungalow were up. I'd move tomorrow. But her twitching lips belied her words, and the next moment the man was more uncomfortable than ever, being made so by her laughter. I was only teasing you, honest Injun, and if you don't laugh, I'll suspect you of being in a temper with me. That's right, laugh, but don't, she added in alarm. Don't, if it hurts you. You look as though you had a toothache. There, don't say it. You know you promised not to quarrel, while I have the privilege of going on being as hateful as I please. And to begin with, there's the Flibberty Gibbet. I didn't know she was so large a cutter, but she's in disgraceful condition. Her rigging is something queer, and the next sharp squall will bring her headgear all about the shop. I watched Noah's face as we sailed past. He didn't say anything. He just sneered, and I don't blame him. Her skipper's rotten bad with fever, Sheldon explained, and he had to drop his mate off to take hold of things at Oogie. That's where I lost Oscar, my trader, and you know what sort of sailors the niggers are. She nodded her head judicially, and while she seemed to debate a weighty judgment, he asked for a second helping of tinned beef, not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to watch her slim, firm fingers, naked of jewels and banded metals, while his eyes pleasured in the swell of the forearm, appearing from under the sleeve and losing identity in the smooth, round wrist, undisfigured by the netted veins that come to youth when youth is gone. The fingers were brown with tan and looked exceedingly boyish. Then, and without effort, the concept came to him. Yes, that was it. He had stumbled upon the clue to her tantalizing personality. Her fingers, sunburned and boyish, told the story. No wonder she had exasperated him so frequently. He had tried to treat with her as a woman when she was not a woman. She was a mere girl, and a boyish girl at that, with sunburned fingers that delighted in doing what boys' fingers did, with a body and muscles that liked swimming and violent endeavor of all sorts, with a mind that was daring, but that dared no farther than boys' adventures, and that delighted in rifles and revolvers, Stetson hats, and a sexless camaraderie with men. Somehow, as he pondered and watched her, it seemed as if he sat in church at home, listening to the choir boys chanting. She reminded him of those boys, or their voices rather. The same sexless quality was there. In the body of her, she was woman. In the mind of her, she had not grown up. She had not been exposed to ripening influences of that sort. She had had no mother. Von, her father, native servants, and rough island life had constituted her training. Horses and rifles had been her toys, camp and trail her nursery. From what she had told him, her seminary days had been an exile, devoted to study and to ceaseless longing for the wild riding and swimming of Hawaii, a boy's training and a boy's point of view. That explained her chafe at petticoats, her revolt at what was only decently conventional. Someday she would grow up, but as yet, she was only in the process. Well, there was only one thing for him to do. He must meet her on her own basis of boyhood and not make the mistake of treating her as a woman. He wondered if he could love the woman she would be when her nature awoke, and he wondered if he could love her just as she was, and himself wake her up. After all, whatever it was, she had come to fill quite a large place in his life, as he had discovered that afternoon while scanning the sea between the squalls. Then he remembered the accounts of Miranda and the cropper that was coming, and scowled. He became aware that she was speaking. "I beg pardon," he said. "What's that you were saying?" "You weren't listening to a word, I knew it," she chided. "I was saying that the condition of the flibberty-gibbet was disgraceful, and that tomorrow, when you've told the skipper and not hurt his feelings, I am going to take my men out and give her an overhauling. We'll scrub her bottom too. Why, there's whiskers on her copper 4 inches long. I saw it when she rolled. Don't forget, I'm going cruising on the Flibberty someday, even if I have to run away with her." While at their coffee on the veranda, Satan raised a commotion in the compound near the beach gate, and Sheldon finally rescued a mauled and frightened black and dragged him on the porch for interrogation. "What fella master you belong?" he demanded. "What name you come along this fella place son he go down?" "Me belong Bouchy. Too many boy belong along Port Adams. Stop along my fella master. Too much walkabout." The black drew a scrap of notepaper from under his belt and passed it over. Sheldon scanned it hurriedly. "It's from Boucher," he explained, "the fellow who took Packard's place. Packard was the one I told you about, who was killed by his boat's crew. He says the Port Adams crowd is out, 50 of them, in big canoes, and camping on his beach. They've killed half a dozen of his pigs already and seem to be looking for trouble, and he's afraid they may connect with the 15 runaways from Lunga." "In which case?" she queried. "In which case, Billy Pape will be compelled to send Boucher's successor. It's Pape's station, you know. I wish I knew what to do. I don't like to leave you here alone." "Take me along, then." He smiled and shook his head. "Then you'd better take my men along," she advised. "They're good shots, and they're not afraid of anything, except Utami, and he's afraid of ghosts." The big bell was rung, and 50 black boys carried the whaleboat down to the water. The regular boat's crew manned her, and Mataware and 3 other Tahitians, belted with cartridges and armed with rifles, sat in the stern sheets where Sheldon stood, at the steering oar. I wish I could go with you," Jones said wistfully, as the boat shoved off. Sheldon shook his head. "I'm as good as a man," she urged. "You really are needed here," he replied. "There's that Lunga crowd. They might reach the coast right here, and with both of us absent, rush the plantation. Goodbye. We'll get back in the morning sometime. It's only 12 miles. When Jones started to return to the house, she was compelled to pass among the boat carriers who lingered on the beach to chatter in queer, ape-like fashion about the events of the night. They made way for her, but there came to her, as she was in the midst of them, a feeling of her own helplessness. There were so many of them. What was to prevent them from dragging her down if they so willed? Then she remembered that one cry of hers would fetch Noah and her remaining sailors, each one of whom was worth a dozen blacks in a struggle. As she opened the gate, one of the boys stepped up to her. In the darkness, she could not make him out. "What name?" she asked sharply. "What name belong you?" "Me Aroa," he said. She remembered him as one of the 2 sick boys she had nursed at the hospital. The other one had died. Me take 'em plenty fella medicine too much, Aroa was saying. Well, and you all right now, she answered. Me want 'em tobacco, plenty fella tobacco. Me want 'em calico. Me want 'em porpoise teeth. Me want 'em one fella belt. She looked at him humorously, expecting to see a smile or at least a grin on his face. Instead, his face was expressionless, save for a narrow breech clout, a pair of earplugs, and about his kinky hair, a chaplet of white cowrie shells. He was naked. His body was fresh-oiled and shiny, and his eyes glistened in the starlight like some wild animals. The rest of the boys had crowded up at his back in a solid wall. Some one of them giggled, but the remainder regarded her in morose and intense silence. Well, she said, what for you? Want plenty fella things. Me take 'em medicine, quoth Aroa. You pay me. And this was a sample of their gratitude, she thought. It looked as if Sheldon had been right after all. Aroa waited stolidly. A leaping fish splashed far out on the water. A tiny wavelet murmured sleepily on the beach. The shadow of a flying fox drifted by in velvet silence overhead. A light air fanned coolly on her cheek. It was the land breeze beginning to blow. You go along quarters, she said, starting to turn on her heel to enter the gate. You pay me, said the boy. Aroa, you all the same one big fool. I no pay you. Now you go. But the black was unmoved. She felt that he was regarding her almost insolently as he repeated, I take a medicine. You pay me. You pay me now. Then it was that she lost her temper and cuffed his ears so soundly as to drive him back among his fellows. But they did not break up. Another boy stepped forward. You pay me, he said. His eyes had the querulous, troubled look such as she had noticed in monkeys, but while he was patently uncomfortable under her scrutiny, his thick lips were drawn firmly in an effort at sullen determination. What for? She asked. Me Gagumi, he said. Bawo brother belong me. Bawo, she remembered, was the sick boy who had died. Go on, she commanded. Bawo take a medicine. Bawo finish. Bawo my brother. You pay me. Father belong me one big fella chief along Port Adams. You pay me. Joan laughed. Gogumi, you just the same as Aroa. One big fool. My word. Who pay me for medicine? She dismissed the matter by passing through the gate and closing it. But Gogumi pressed up against it and said impudently, Father belong me one big fella chief. You know Bangham Head belong me. My word, you fright too much. Me fright? She demanded, while anger tingled all through her. Too much fright, Bangham Head belong me, Gogumi said proudly. And then she reached for him across the gate and got him. It was a sweeping, broad-handed slap, so heavy that he staggered sideways and nearly fell. He sprang for the gate as if to force it open, while the crowd surged forward against the fence. Joan thought rapidly. Her revolver was hanging on the wall of her grass house. Yet one cry would bring her sailors, and she knew she was safe. So she did not cry for help. Instead, she whistled for Satan, at the same time calling him by name. She knew he was shut up in the living room, but the blacks did not wait to see. They fled with wild yells through the darkness, followed reluctantly by Gogumi, while she entered the bungalow, laughing at first, but finally vexed to the verge of tears by what had taken place. She had sat up a whole night with the boy who had died, and yet his brother demanded to be paid for his life. Ugh, the ungrateful beast, she muttered, while she debated whether or not she would confess the incident to Sheldon. Chapter 11. The Port Adams Crowd. And so it was all settled easily enough, Sheldon was saying. He was on the veranda, drinking coffee. The whaleboat was being carried into its shed. Boucher was a bit timid at first to carry off the situation with a strong hand, but he did very well once we got started. We made a play at holding a court, and Telepass, the old scoundrel, accepted the findings. He's a Port Adams chief, a filthy beggar. We fined him 10 times the value of the pigs and made him move on with his mob. Oh, they're a sweet lot, I must say, at least 60 of them, in 5 big canoes and out for trouble. They've got a dozen Snyders that ought to be confiscated. Why didn't you, Joan asked, and have a row on my hands with the commissioner? He's terribly touchy about his black wards, as he calls them. Well, we started them along their way, though they went in on the beach to Kai Kai several miles back. They ought to pass here sometime today. 2 hours later, the canoes arrived. No one saw them come. The houseboys were busy in the kitchen at their own breakfast. The plantation hands were similarly occupied in their quarters. Satan lay sound asleep on his back, under the billiard table, in his sleep brushing at the flies that pestered him. Joan was rummaging in the storeroom, and Sheldon was taking his siesta in a hammock on the veranda. He awoke gently. In some occult, subtle way, a warning that all was not well had penetrated his sleep and aroused him. Without moving, he glanced down and saw the ground beneath, covered with armed savages. They were the same ones he had parted with that morning, though he noted an accession in numbers. There were men he had not seen before. He slipped from the hammock and with deliberate slowness sauntered to the railing, where he yawned sleepily and looked down on them. It came to him curiously that it was his destiny ever to stand on this high place, looking down on unending hordes of black trouble that required control, bullying, and cajolery. But while he glanced carelessly over them, he was keenly taking stock. The new men were all armed with modern rifles. Ah, he had thought so. There were 15 of them, undoubtedly the Lunga runaways. In addition, a dozen old Snyders were in the hands of the original crowd. The rest were armed with spears, clubs, bows and arrows, and long-handled tomahawks. Beyond, drawn up on the beach, he could see the big war canoes, with high and fantastically carved bows and sterns, ornamented with scrolls and bands of white cowrie shells. These were the men who had killed his trader, Oscar, at Ugi. "What name you walk about this place?" he demanded. At the same time, he stole a glance seaward to where the Flibberty-Gibbet reflected herself in the glassy calm of the sea. Not a soul was visible under her awnings, and he saw the whaleboat was missing from alongside. The Tahitians had evidently gone shooting fish up the Balisuna. He was all alone in his high place above this trouble, while his world slumbered peacefully under the breathless tropic noon. Nobody replied, and he repeated his demand, more of mastery in his voice this time, and a hint of growing anger. The blacks moved uneasily, like a herd of cattle, at the sound of his voice, but not one spoke. All eyes, however, were staring at him in certitude of expectancy. Something was about to happen, and they were waiting for it, waiting with the unanimous, unstable mob mind for the one of them who would make the first action that would precipitate all of them into a common action. Sheldon looked for this one, for such was the one to fear. Directly beneath him, he caught sight of the muzzle of a rifle, barely projecting between 2 black bodies, that was slowly elevating toward him. It was held at the hip by a man in the second row. "What name you?" Sheldon suddenly shouted, pointing directly at the man who held the gun, who startled and lowered the muzzle. Sheldon still held the whip hand, and he intended to keep it. "Clear out, all you fella boys," he ordered. "Clear out and walk along salt water. Savvy. Me talk, spoke up a fat and filthy savage whose hairy chest was caked with the unwashed dirt of years. Oh, is that you, Telepass? The white man queried genially. You tell 'em boys clear out, and you stop and talk along me. Him good fella boy, was the reply. Him stop along. Well, what do you want? Sheldon asked, striving to hide under assumed carelessness the weakness of concession. That fella boy belong along me. The old chief pointed out Gogumi, whom Sheldon recognized. White Mary, belong you too much no good, Telepass went on. Bangham Head, belong Gogumi. Gogumi, all the same chief. Bime be me finish, Gogumi, big fella chief. White Mary, Bangham Head, no good. You pay me plenty tobacco, plenty powder, plenty calico. You old scoundrel, was Sheldon's comment. An hour before, he had been chuckling over Joan's recital of the episode, and here, an hour later, was Telepass himself come to collect damages. Gogumi, Sheldon ordered, what name you walk about here? You get along quarters, plenty quick. Me stop, was the defiant answer. White Mary belong you Bangham Head, old Telepass began again. My word, plenty big fella trouble you no pay. You talk along, boys, Sheldon said, with increasing irritation. You tell 'em get to hell along beach. Then I talk with you. Sheldon felt a slight vibration of the veranda and knew that Joan had come out and was standing by his side. But he did not dare glance at her. There were too many rifles down below there, and rifles had a way of going off from the hip. Again the veranda vibrated with her moving weight, and he knew that Joan had gone into the house. A minute later, she was back beside him. He had never seen her smoke, and it struck him as peculiar that she should be smoking now. Then he guessed the reason. With a quick glance, he noted the hand at her side, and in it, the familiar, paper-wrapped dynamite. He noted also the end of fuse, split properly, into which had been inserted the head of a wax match. Telepass, you old reprobate, tell 'em boys clear out along beach. My word, I no gammon along you. Me no gammon, said the chief. Me want 'em pay White Mary, Bangham Head belong Gogumi. I'll come down there and Bangham Head belong you, Sheldon replied, leaning toward the railing, as if about to leap over. An angry murmur arose, and the blacks surged restlessly. The muzzles of many guns were rising from the hips. Joan was pressing the lighted end of the cigarette to the fuse. A Snyder went off with the roar of a bomb gun, and Sheldon heard a pane of window glass crash behind him. At the same moment, Joan flung the dynamite, the fuse hissing and spluttering, into the thick of the blacks. They scattered back in too great haste to do any more shooting. Satan, aroused by the one shot, was snarling and panting to be let out. Joan heard and ran to let him out, and thereat the tragedy was averted, and the comedy began. Rifles and spears were dropped or flung aside in a wild scramble for the protection of the coconut palms. Satan multiplied himself. Never had he been free to tear and rend such a quantity of black flesh before, and he bit and snapped and rushed the flying legs till the last pair were above his head. All were treed except Telepass, who was too old and fat, and he lay prone and without movement where he had fallen, while Satan, with too great a heart to worry an enemy that did not move, dashed frantically from tree to tree, barking and springing at those who clung on lowest down. I fancy you need a lesson or two in inserting fuses, Sheldon remarked dryly. Joan's eyes were scornful. There was no detonator on it, she said. Besides, The detonator is not yet manufactured that will explode that charge. It's only a bottle of chlorodyne." She put her fingers into her mouth, and Sheldon winced as he saw her blow, like a boy, a sharp, imperious whistle, the call she always used for her sailors, and that always made him wince. "They're gone up the Ballissuna shooting fish," he explained. "But there comes Olson, with his boat's crew. He's an old warhorse when he gets started. See him banging the boys. They don't pull fast enough for him." "And now what's to be done?" she asked. "You've treed your game, but you can't keep it treed." "No, but I can teach them a lesson." Sheldon walked over to the big bell. "It is all right," he replied to her gesture of protest. "My boys are practically all bushmen, while these chaps are saltwater men, and there's no love lost between them. You watch the fun." He rang a general call, and by the time the 200 laborers trooped into the compound, Satan was once more penned in the living room, complaining to high heaven at his abominable treatment. The plantation hands were dancing war dances around the base of every tree and filling the air with abuse and vituperation of their hereditary enemies. The skipper of the Flibberty-Gibbet arrived in the thick of it, in the first throes of oncoming fever, staggering as he walked and shivering so severely that he could scarcely hold the rifle he carried. His face was ghastly blue, his teeth clicked and chattered, and the violent sunshine through which he walked could not warm him. "I'll sit down and keep a guard on 'em," he chattered. Dash it all, I always get for fever when there's any excitement." What are you going to do?" "Gather up the guns first of all." Under Sheldon's direction, the houseboys and gang bosses collected the scattered arms and piled them in a heap on the veranda. The modern rifles, stolen from Lunga, Sheldon set aside. The Snyders he smashed into fragments. The pile of spears, clubs and tomahawks he presented to Joan. "A really unique addition to your collection," he smiled. "Picked up right on the battlefield." Down on the beach, he built a bonfire out of the contents of the canoes, his blacks smashing, breaking, and looting everything they laid hands on. The canoes themselves, splintered and broken, filled with sand and coral. Boulders were towed out to 10 fathoms of water and sunk. 10 fathoms will be deep enough for them to work in," Sheldon said, as they walked back to the compound. Here, a saturnalia had broken loose. The war songs and dances were more unrestrained, and, from abuse, the plantation blacks had turned to pelting their helpless foes with pieces of wood, handfuls of pebbles, and chunks of coral rock, and the 75 lusty cannibals clung stoically to their tree perches, enduring the rain of missiles and snarling down promises of vengeance. "There'll be wars for 40 years on Malaita on account of this," Sheldon laughed, "but I always fancy old Telepass will never again attempt to rush a plantation." "Hey, you old scoundrel," he added, turning to the old chief, who sat gibbering in impotent rage at the foot of the steps. "Now head belong you bang 'em too. Come on, Miss Lackland. Bang 'em just once. It will be the crowning indignity." "Ugh, he's too dirty. I'd rather give him a bath. Here you, Adamu Adam, give this devil a wash. Soap and water. Fill that wash tub. On fiery, run and fetch 'em scrub brush." The Tahitians, back from their fishing and grinning at the bedlam of the compound, entered into the joke. "Tambo, Tambo," shrieked the cannibals from the trees, appalled at so awful a desecration as they saw their chief tumbled into the tub and the sacred dirt rubbed and soused from his body. Joan, who had gone into the bungalow, tossed down a strip of white calico in which old Telepass was promptly wrapped, and he stood forth, resplendent and purified. Withal he still spat and strangled from the soap suds with which Noah had gargled his throat. The houseboys were directed to fetch handcuffs, and one by one, the Lunga runaways were haled down out of their trees and made fast. Sheldon ironed them in pairs and ran a steel chain through the links of the irons. Kagumi was given a lecture for his mutinous conduct and locked up for the afternoon. Then Sheldon rewarded the plantation hands with an afternoon's holiday, and when they had withdrawn from the compound, permitted the Port Adams men to descend from the trees. And all afternoon he and Joan loafed in the cool of the veranda and watched them diving down and emptying their sunken canoes of the sand and rocks. It was twilight when they embarked and paddled away with a few broken paddles. A breeze had sprung up, and the Flibbertigibbet had already sailed for Lunga to return the runaways. Chapter 12. Mr. Morgan and Mr. Raff. Sheldon was back in the plantation, superintending the building of a bridge, when the schooner Malakula ran in close and dropped anchor. Joan watched the taking in of sail and the swinging out of the boat with a sailor's interest, and herself met the two men who came ashore. While one of the houseboys ran to fetch Sheldon, she had the visitors served with whiskey and soda, and sat and talked with them. They seemed awkward and constrained in her presence, and she caught first one and then the other, looking at her with secret curiosity. She felt that they were weighing her, appraising her, and for the first time, the anomalous position she occupied on Barandi sank sharply home to her. On the other hand, they puzzled her. They were neither traders nor sailors of any type she had known, nor did they talk like gentlemen, despite the fact that there was nothing offensive in their bearing and that the veneer of ordinary social nicety was theirs. Undoubtedly, they were men of affairs, businessmen of a sort. But what affairs should they have in the Solomons, and what business on Baranda? The elder one, Morgan, was a huge man, bronzed and mustached, with a deep bass voice and an almost guttural speech, and the other, Raff, was slight and effeminate, with nervous hands and watery, washed-out grey eyes, who spoke with a faint, indefinable accent that was hauntingly reminiscent of the Cockney, and that was yet not Cockney of any brand she had ever encountered. Whatever they were self-made men, she concluded, and she felt the impulse to shudder at thought of falling into their hands in a business way. There, they would be merciless. She watched Sheldon closely when he arrived, and divined that he was not particularly delighted to see them. But see them he must, and so pressing was the need that after a little perfunctory general conversation, he led the two men into the stuffy office. Later in the afternoon, she asked Lalaperu where they had gone. "My word," quoth Lalaperu, "plenty walk about, plenty lookum. Lookum tree, lookum ground belong tree, lookum all fella bridge, lookum copra, house, lookum grass land, lookum river, lookum whale boat. My word, plenty big fella lookum too much." "What fella man them two fella?" she queried. "Big fella master, a long white man," was the extent of his description. But Joan decided that they were men of importance in the Solomons, and that their examination of the plantation and of its accounts was of sinister significance. At dinner, no word was dropped that gave a hint of their errand. The conversation was on general topics, but Joan could not help noticing the troubled, absent expression that occasionally came into Sheldon's eyes. After coffee, she left them, and at midnight, from across the compound, she could hear the low murmur of their voices and see glowing the fiery ends of their cigars. Up early herself, she found they had already departed on another tramp over the plantation. "What you think?" she asked Viaburi. "Sheldon master he go along, finish short time little bit," was the answer. "What you think?" she asked on fiery. "Sheldon master big fella walk about along Sydney. Yes, me think so. He finish along Barandi. All day the examination of the plantation and the discussion went on, and all day the skipper of the Malakula sent urgent messages ashore for the two men to hasten. It was not until sunset that they went down to the boat, and even then a final talk of nearly an hour took place on the beach. Sheldon was combating something that she could plainly see, and that his two visitors were not giving in, she could also plainly see. "What name?" she asked lightly when Sheldon sat down to dinner. He looked at her and smiled, but it was a very wan and wistful smile. "My word," she went on. "One big fella talk, son he go down, talk talk, son he come up, talk talk, all the time talk talk. What name that fella talk talk?" "Oh, nothing much." He shrugged his shoulders. "They were trying to buy Barande, that was all." She looked at him challengingly. "It must have been more than that. It was you who wanted to sell." "Indeed no, Miss Lackland. I assure you that I am far from desiring to sell." "Don't let us fence about it," she urged. "Let it be straight talk between us. You're in trouble. I'm not a fool. Tell me. Besides, I may be able to help, to suggest something." In the pause that followed, he seemed to debate, not so much whether he would tell her, as how to begin to tell her. "I'm American, you see," she persisted, "and our American heritage is a large parcel of business sense. I don't like it myself, but I know I've got it, at least more than you have. Let us talk it over and find a way out. How much do you owe?" £1,000, and a few trifles over. Small bills, you know. Then, too, 30 of the boys finish their time next week, and their balances will average £10 each. But what is the need of bothering your head with it? Really, you know. What is Barandi worth? Right now? Whatever Morgan and Raff are willing to pay for it. A glance at her hurt expression decided him. Hughie and I have sunk £8,000 in it, and our time. It is a good property and worth more than that. But it has 3 years to run before its returns begin to come in. That is why Hughie and I engaged in trading and recruiting. The Jessie and our stations came very near to paying the running expenses of Barandi. And Morgan and Raff offered you what? £1,000 clear, after paying all bills. "The thieves!" she cried. "No, they're good businessmen, that is all. As they told me, a thing is worth no more than one is willing to pay or to receive." "And how much do you need to carry on Barande for 3 years?" Joan hurried on. 200 boys at £6 a year means £3,600. That's the main item. My, how cheap labour does mount up. £3,600, $18,000, just for a lot of cannibals. Yet the place is good security. You could go down to Sydney and raise the money. He shook his head. "You can't get them to look at plantations down there. They've been taken in too often. But I do hate to give the place up. More for Hughie's sake, I swear, than my own. He was bound up in it. You see, he was a persistent chap and hated to acknowledge defeat. It makes me uncomfortable to think of it myself. We were running slowly behind, but with the Jessie, we hoped to muddle through in some fashion." "You were muddlers, the pair of you, without doubt, but you needn't sell to Morgan and Raff. I shall go down to Sydney on the next steamer, and I'll come back in a second-hand schooner. I should be able to buy one for $5,000 or $6,000. He held up his hand in protest, but she waved it aside. "I may manage to freight a cargo back as well. At any rate, the schooner will take over the Jessie's business. You can make your arrangements accordingly and have plenty of work for her when I get back. I'm going to become a partner in Barande to the extent of my bag of sovereigns. I've got over 1,500 of them, you know. We'll draw up an agreement right now. That is, with your permission, and I know you won't refuse it." He looked at her with good-natured amusement. "You know I sailed here all the way from Tahiti in order to become a planter," she insisted. "You know what my plans were. Now I've changed them, that's all. I'd rather be a part owner of Barande and get my returns in 3 years than break ground on Parisulai and wait 7 years. And this schooner—" Sheldon changed his mind and stopped. "Yes, go on." "You won't be angry?" he queried. "No, no, this is business. Go on." "You, you would run her yourself? Be the captain, in short, and go recruiting on Malaita?" "Certainly. We would save the cost of a skipper. Under an agreement, you would be credited with a manager's salary, and I with a captain's. It's quite simple. Besides, if you won't let me be your partner, I shall buy Parisulai, get a much smaller vessel, and run her myself. So what is the difference?" "The difference? Why, all the difference in the world. In the case of Parisulai, you would be on an independent venture. You could turn cannibal for all I could interfere in the matter. But on Barande, you would be my partner, and then I would be responsible. And of course, I couldn't permit you, as my partner, to be skipper of a recruiter. I tell you, the thing is, what I would not permit any sister or wife of mine. But I'm not going to be your wife, thank goodness, only your partner. Besides, it's all ridiculous." He held on steadily. "Think of the situation. A man and a woman, both young, partners on an isolated plantation. Why, the only practical way out would be that I'd have to marry you." "Mine was a business proposition, not a marriage proposal," she interrupted, coldly angry. "I wonder if somewhere in this world there is one man who could accept me for a comrade." "But you are a woman just the same," he began, "and there are certain conventions, certain decencies." She sprang up and stamped her foot. "Do you know what I'd like to say?" she demanded. "Yes," he smiled. "You'd like to say, 'Damn petticoats.'" She nodded her head ruefully. "That's what I wanted to say, but it sounds different on your lips. It sounds as though you meant it yourself, and that you meant it because of me. Well, I am going to bed, but do, please, think over my proposition, and let me know in the morning. There's no use in my discussing it now. You make me so angry. You are cowardly, you know, and very egotistic. You are afraid of what other fools will say. No matter how honest your motives, if others criticized your actions, your feelings would be hurt. And you think more about your own wretched feelings than you do about mine. And then, being a coward, all men are at heart cowards. You disguise your cowardice by calling it chivalry. I thank heaven that I was not born a man. Good night. Do think it over. And don't be foolish. What Miranda needs is good American hustle. You don't know what that is. You are a muddler. Besides, you are enervated. I'm fresh to the climate. Let me be your partner, and you'll see me rattle the dry bones of the Solomons. Confess, I've rattled yours already." "I should say so," he answered. "Really, you know, you have. I never received such a dressing down in my life. If anyone had ever told me that I'd be a party even to the present situation. Yes, I confess, you have rattled my dry bones pretty considerably. But that is nothing to the rattling they are going to get," she assured him, as he rose and took her hand. "Good night, and do give me a rational decision in the morning." Chapter 13. The Logic of Youth. "I wish I knew whether you are merely headstrong or whether you really intend to be a Solomon planter," Sheldon said in the morning at breakfast. "I wish you were more adaptable," Joan retorted. "You have more preconceived notions than any man I ever met. Why, in the name of common sense, in the name of fair play, can't you get it into your head that I am different from the women you have known and treat me accordingly? You surely ought to know I am different. I sailed my own schooner here. Skipper, if you please. I came here to make my living. You know that. I've told you often enough. It was Dad's plan, and I'm carrying it out, just as you are trying to carry out your Huey's plan. Dad started to sail and sail until he could find the proper islands for planting. He died, and I sailed and sailed until I arrived here. Well, she shrugged her shoulders. The schooner is at the bottom of the sea. I can't sail any farther, therefore I remain here, and a planter I shall certainly be. You see, he began. I haven't got to the point, she interrupted. Looking back on my conduct, from the moment I first set foot on your beach, I can see no false pretense that I have made about myself or my intentions. I was my natural self to you from the first. I told you my plans, and yet you sit there and calmly tell me that you don't know whether I really intend to become a planter or whether it is all obstinacy and pretense. Now let me assure you, for the last time, that I really and truly shall become a planter, thanks to you or in spite of you. Do you want me for a partner? But do you realize that I would be looked upon as the most foolish jackanapes in the South Seas if I took a young girl like you in with me here on Barande? He asked. No, decidedly not. But there you are again, worrying about what idiots and the generally evil-minded will think of you. I should have thought you had learned self-reliance on Baranda, instead of needing to lean upon the moral support of every whiskey-guzzling, worthless South Sea vagabond. He smiled and said, Yes, that is the worst of it. You are unanswerable. Yours is the logic of youth, and no man can answer that. The facts of life can, but they have no place in the logic of youth. Youth must try to live according to its logic. That is the only way to learn better. There is no harm in trying, she interjected. But there is. That is the very point. The facts always smash youth's logic, and they usually smash youth's heart too. It's like platonic friendships and all such things. They are all right in theory, but they won't work in practice. I used to believe in such things once. That is why I am here in the Solomons at present. Joan was impatient. He saw that she could not understand. Life was too clearly simple to her. It was only the youth who was arguing with him, the youth with youth's pure-minded and invincible reasoning. Hers was only the boy's soul in a woman's body. He looked at her flushed, eager face, at the great ropes of hair coiled on the small head, at the rounded lines of the figure showing plainly through the homemade gown, and at the eyes, boy's eyes, under cool, level brows. And he wondered why a being that was so much beautiful woman should be no woman at all. Why in the deuce was she not carroty-haired, or cross-eyed, or hair-lipped? Suppose we do become partners on Barandi, he said, at the same time experiencing a feeling of fright at the prospect that was tangled with a contradictory feeling of charm. Either I'll fall in love with you, or you with me. Propinquity is dangerous, you know. In fact, it is propinquity that usually gives the facer to the logic of youth. If you think I came to the Solomons to get married, she began wrathfully, well, there are better men in Hawaii, that's all. Really, you know, the way you harp on that one string would lead an unprejudiced listener to conclude that you are prurient-minded. She stopped, appalled. His face had gone red and white with such abruptness as to startle her. He was patently very angry. She sipped the last of her coffee and arose, saying, I'll wait until you are in a better temper before taking up the discussion again. That is what's the matter with you. You get angry too easily. Will you come swimming? The tide is just right. If she were a man, I'd bundle her off the plantation route and crop, whaleboat, Tahitian sailors, sovereigns, and all, he muttered to himself after she had left the room. But that was the trouble. She was not a man, and where would she go? And what would happen to her? He got to his feet, lighted a cigarette, and her Stetson hat, hanging on the wall over her revolver belt, caught his eye. That was the devil of it too. He did not want her to go. After all, she had not grown up yet. That was why her logic hurt. It was only the logic of youth, but it could hurt damnably at times. At any rate, he would resolve upon one thing. Never again would he lose his temper with her. She was a child, he must remember that. He sighed heavily. But why in reasonableness had such a child been incorporated in such a woman's form? And as he continued to stare at her hat and think, the hurt he had received passed away, and he found himself cudgeling his brains for some way out of the muddle, for some method by which she could remain on Baranda. A chaperone. Why not? He could send to Sydney on the first steamer for one. He could. Her trilling laughter smote upon his reverie, and he stepped to the screen door, through which he could see her running down the path to the beach. At her heels ran two of her sailors, Papahara and Mahamem, in scarlet lava-lavas, with naked sheath knives gleaming in their belts. It was another sample of her willfulness. Despite entreaties and commands and warnings of the danger from sharks, she persisted in swimming at any and all times, and by special preference, it seemed to him, immediately after eating. He watched her take the water, diving cleanly, like a boy, from the end of the little pier, and he watched her strike out with single overhand stroke, her henchmen swimming a dozen feet on either side. He did not have much faith in their ability to beat off a hungry man-eater, though he did believe, implicitly, that their lives would go bravely before hers in case of an attack. Straight out, they swam, their heads growing smaller and smaller. There was a slight, restless heave to the sea, and soon the three heads were disappearing behind it with greater frequency. He strained his eyes to keep them in sight, and finally fetched the telescope onto the veranda. A squall was making over from the direction of Florida, but then she and her men laughed at squalls and the white choppy sea at such times. She certainly could swim, he had long since concluded. That came of her training in Hawaii. But sharks were sharks, and he had known of more than one good swimmer drowned in a tide rip. The squall blackened the sky, beat the ocean white where he had last seen the three heads, and then blotted out sea and sky and everything with its deluge of rain. It passed on, and Baranda emerged in the bright sunshine as the three swimmers emerged from the sea. Sheldon slipped inside with the telescope, and through the screen door watched her run up the path, shaking down her hair as she ran, to the fresh water shower under the house. On the veranda that afternoon, he broached the proposition of a chaperone as delicately as he could, explaining the necessity at Barandi for such a body, a housekeeper to run the boys and the storeroom, and perform divers other useful functions. When he had finished, he waited anxiously for what Joan would say. "Then you don't like the way I've been managing the house," was her first objection. And next, brushing his attempted explanations aside, one of two things would happen. Either I should cancel our partnership agreement and go away, leaving you to get another chaperone to chaperone your chaperone, or else I'd take the old hen out in the whaleboat and drown her. Do you imagine for one moment that I sailed my schooner down here to this raw edge of the earth in order to put myself under a chaperone? But really, a chaperone is a necessary evil," he objected. "We've got along very nicely so far without one. Did I have one on the Mealy? And yet I was the only woman on board. There are only three things I am afraid of: bumblebees, scarlet fever, and chaperones. Ugh, the clucking, evil-minded monsters, finding wrong in everything, seeing sin in the most innocent actions, and suggesting sin, yes, causing sin, by their diseased imaginings. Phew! Sheldon leaned back from the table in mock fear. You needn't worry about your bread and butter, he ventured. If you fail at planting, you would be sure to succeed as a writer. Novels with a purpose, you know. I didn't think there were persons in the Solomons who needed such books, she retaliated. But you are certainly one. You and your custodians of virtue. He winced, but Joan rattled on with the platitudinous originality of youth. As if anything good were worthwhile when it has to be guarded and put in leg irons and handcuffs in order to keep it good. Your desire for a chaperone as much as implies that I am that sort of creature. I prefer to be good because it is good to be good, rather than because I can't be bad, because some argus-eyed old frump won't let me have a chance to be bad. But it is not that, he put in. It is what others will think. Let them think, the nasty-minded wretches. It is because men like you are afraid of the nasty-minded that you allow their opinions to rule you. I am afraid you are a female Shelley, he replied, and as such, you really drive me to become your partner in order to protect you. If you take me as a partner in order to protect me, I shan't be your partner, that's all. You'll drive me into buying Paris-Soleil yet. All the more reason, he attempted. Do you know what I'll do? She demanded. I'll find some man in the Solomons who won't want to protect me. Sheldon could not conceal the shock her words gave him. You don't mean that, you know, he pleaded. I do. I really do. I am sick and tired of this protection dodge. Don't forget for a moment that I am perfectly able to take care of myself. Besides, I have 8 of the best protectors in the world, my sailors. You should have lived 1,000 years ago, he laughed, or 1,000 years hence. You are very primitive and equally supermodern. The 20th century is no place for you. But the Solomon Islands are. You were living like a savage when I came along and found you, eating nothing but tinned meat and scones that would have ruined the digestion of a camel. Anyway, I've remedied that. And since we are to be partners, it will stay remedied. You won't die of malnutrition. Be sure of that. If we enter into partnership, he announced, it must be thoroughly understood that you are not allowed to run the schooner. You can go down to Sydney and buy her, but a skipper we must have at so much additional expense, and most likely a whiskey-drinking, irresponsible, and incapable man to boot. Besides, I'd have the business more at heart than any man we could hire. As for capability, I tell you I can sail all around the average broken captain or promoted able seaman you find in the South Seas. And you know I am a navigator. But being my partner, he said coolly, makes you nonetheless a lady. Thank you for telling me that my contemplated conduct is unladylike. She arose, tears of anger and mortification in her eyes, and went over to the phonograph. I wonder if all men are as ridiculous as you, she said. He shrugged his shoulders and smiled. Discussion was useless. He had learned that, and he was resolved to keep his temper. And before the day was out, she capitulated. She was to go to Sydney on the first steamer, purchase the schooner, and sail back with an island skipper on board. And then she inveigled Sheldon into agreeing that she could take occasional cruises in the islands, though he was adamant when it came to a recruiting trip on Malaita. That was the one thing barred. And after it was all over, and a terse and businesslike agreement, by her urging, drawn up and signed, Sheldon paced up and down for a full hour, meditating upon How many different kinds of a fool he had made of himself. It was an impossible situation, and yet no more impossible than the previous one, and no more impossible than the one that would have obtained had she gone off on her own and bought Paris Soleil. He had never seen a more independent woman who stood more in need of a protector than this boy-minded girl who had landed on his beach with 8 picturesque savages, a long-barreled revolver, a bag of gold, and a gaudy merchandise of imagined romance and adventure. He had never read of anything to compare with it. The fictionists, as usual, were exceeded by fact. The whole thing was too preposterous to be true. He gnawed his moustache and smoked cigarette after cigarette. Satan, back from a prowl around the compound, ran up to him and touched his hand with a cold, damp nose. Sheldon caressed the animal's ears, then threw himself into a chair and laughed heartily. What would the commissioner of the Solomons think? What would his people at home think? And in the one breath, he was glad that the partnership had been effected, and sorry that Joan Lackland had ever come to the Solomons. Then he went inside and looked at himself in a hand mirror. He studied the reflection long and thoughtfully and wonderingly. Chapter 14. The Martha. They were deep in a game of billiards the next morning, after the 11 o'clock breakfast, when Viaburi entered and announced, "Big fella schooner close up." Even as he spoke, they heard the rumble of chain through hawse pipe, and from the veranda saw a big black-painted schooner swinging to her just-caught anchor. "It's a Yankee," Joan cried. "See that bow, look at that elliptical stern. Ah, I thought so," as the stars and stripes fluttered to the masthead. Noah, at Sheldon's direction, ran the Union Jack up the flagstaff. "Now, what is an American vessel doing down here?" Joan asked. "It's not a yacht, though I'll wager she can sail. Look, her name. What is it?" "Martha, San Francisco," Sheldon read, looking through the telescope. "It's the first Yankee I ever heard of in the Solomons. They are coming ashore, whoever they are. And by Jove, look at those men at the oars. It's an all-white crew. Now, what reason brings them here?" "They're not proper sailors," Joan commented. "I'd be ashamed of a crew of black boys that pulled in such fashion. Look at that fellow in the bow, the one just jumping out. He'd be more at home on a cow pony." The boat's crew scattered up and down the beach, ranging about with eager curiosity, while the 2 men who had sat in the stern sheets opened the gate and came up the path to the bungalow. One of them, a tall and slender man, was clad in white ducks that fitted him like a semi-military uniform. The other man, in nondescript garments that were both of the sea and shore, and that must have been uncomfortably hot, slouched and shambled like an overgrown ape. To complete the illusion, his face seemed to sprout in all directions, with a dense, bushy mass of red whiskers, while his eyes were small and sharp and restless. Sheldon, who had gone to the head of the steps, introduced them to Joan. The bewhiskered individual, who looked like a Scotsman, had the Teutonic name of von Blix and spoke with a strong American accent. The tall man in the well-fitting ducks, who gave the English name of Tudor, John Tudor, talked purely enunciated English, such as any cultured American would talk, save for the fact that it was most delicately and subtly touched by a faint German accent. Joan decided that she had been helped to identify the accent by the short, German-looking moustache that did not conceal the mouth and its full red lips, which would have formed a Cupid's bow, but for some harshness or severity of spirit that had molded them masculinely. Von Blix was rough and boorish, but Tudor was gracefully easy in everything he did, or looked, or said. His blue eyes sparkled and flashed. His clean-cut, mobile features were an index to his slightest shades of feeling and expression. He bubbled with enthusiasms, and his faintest smile or lightest laugh seemed spontaneous and genuine. But it was only occasionally at first that he spoke, for von Blix told their story and stated their errand. They were on a gold-hunting expedition. He was the leader, and Tudor was his lieutenant. All hands, and there were 28, were shareholders, in varying proportions, in the adventure. Several were sailors, but the large majority were miners, culled from all the camps from Mexico to the Arctic Ocean. It was the old and ever untiring pursuit of gold, and they had come to the Solomons to get it. Part of them, under the leadership of Tudor, were to go up the Balasuna and penetrate the mountainous heart of Guadalcanar, while the Martha, under von Blix, sailed away for Malaita to put through similar exploration. "And so," said von Blix, "for Mr. Tudor's expedition, we must have some black boys. Can we get them from you?" "Of course we will pay," Tudor broke in. "You have only to charge what you consider them worth. You pay them £6 a year, don't you?" "In the first place, we can't spare them," Sheldon answered. "We are short of them on the plantation as it is." "We?" Tudor asked quickly. "Then you are a firm or a partnership? I understood at Guvutu that you were alone, that you had lost your partner." Sheldon inclined his head toward Joan, and as he spoke, she felt that he had become a trifle stiff. "Miss Lackland has become interested in the plantation since then, but to return to the boys. We can't spare them, and besides, they would be of little use. You couldn't get them to accompany you beyond Binu, which is a short day's work with the boats from here. They are Malaita men, and they are afraid of being eaten. They would desert you at the first opportunity. You could get the Binu men to accompany you another day's journey through the grasslands, but at the first roll of the foothills, look for them to turn back. They likewise are disinclined to being eaten." "Is it as bad as that?" asked von Blix. "The interior of Guadalcanar has never been explored," Sheldon explained. "The Bushmen are as wild men as are to be found anywhere in the world today. I have never seen one. I have never seen a man who has seen one. They never come down to the coast, though their scouting parties occasionally eat a coast native who has wandered too far inland. Nobody knows anything about them. They don't even use tobacco, have never learned its use. The Austrian expedition, scientists, you know, got part way in before it was cut to pieces. The monument is up the beach there several miles. Only one man got back to the coast to tell the tale. And now, you have all I or any other man knows of the inside of Guadalcanar." "But gold? Have you heard of gold?" Tudor asked impatiently. "Do you know anything about gold?" Sheldon smiled, while the two visitors hung eagerly upon his words. "You can go 2 miles up the Balasuna and wash colors from the gravel. I've done it often. There is gold undoubtedly back in the mountains." Tudor and von Blix looked triumphantly at each other. "Old Wheat Sheaf's yarn was true then," Tudor said, and von Blix nodded. "And if Malaita turns out as well?" Tudor broke off and looked at Joan. "It was the tale of this old beachcomber that brought us here," he explained. Von Blix befriended him and was told the secret. He turned and addressed Sheldon. "I think we shall prove that white men have been through the heart of Guadalcanar long before the time of the Austrian expedition." Sheldon shrugged his shoulders. "We have never heard of it down here," he said simply. Then he addressed von Blix. "As to the boys, you couldn't use them farther than Binu, and I'll lend you as many as you want as far as that. How many of your party are going, and how soon will you start?" 10, said Tudor. 9 men and myself." and you should be able to start day after tomorrow, von Blix said to him. The boats should practically be knocked together this afternoon. Tomorrow should see the outfit portioned and packed. As for the Martha, Mr. Sheldon, we'll rush the stuff ashore this afternoon and sail by sundown. As the two men returned down the path to their boat, Sheldon regarded Joan quizzically. There's romance for you, he said, and adventure, gold hunting among the cannibals. A title for a book, she cried. Or better yet, gold hunting among the headhunters. My, wouldn't it sell? And now, aren't you sorry you became a coconut planter? He teased. Think of investing in such an adventure. If I did, she retorted, von Blix wouldn't be finicky about my joining in the cruise to Malaita. I don't doubt, but what he would jump at it. What do you think of them? She asked. Oh, old von Blix is all right, a solid sort of chap in his fashion, but Tudor is flyaway, too much on the surface, you know. If it came to being wrecked on a desert island, I'd prefer von Blix. I don't quite understand, Joan objected. What have you against Tudor? You remember Browning's Last Duchess? She nodded. Well, Tudor reminds me of her. But she was delightful. So she was, but she was a woman. One expects something different from a man. More control, you know, more restraint, more deliberation. A man must be more solid and steady-going and less effervescent. A man of Tudor's type gets on my nerves. One demands more repose from a man. Joan felt that she did not quite agree with his judgment, and somehow Sheldon caught her feeling and was disturbed. He remembered noting how her eyes had brightened as she talked with the newcomer. Confound it all, was he getting jealous? He asked himself. Why shouldn't her eyes brighten? What concern was it of his? A second boat had been lowered, and the outfit of the shore party was landed rapidly. A dozen of the crew put the knocked-down boats together on the beach. There were 5 of these craft, lean and narrow, with flaring sides and remarkably long. Each was equipped with 3 paddles and several iron-shod poles. You chaps certainly seem to know river work, Sheldon told one of the carpenters. The man spat a mouthful of tobacco juice into the white sand and answered, We use 'em in Alaska. They're modeled after the Yukon poling boats, and you can bet your life they're crackerjacks. This creek'll be a snap alongside some of them northern streams. 500 pounds in one of them boats, and 2 men can snake it along in a way that'd surprise you. At sunset, the Martha broke out her anchor and got underway, dipping her flag and saluting with a bomb gun. The Union Jack ran up and down the staff, and Sheldon replied with his brass signal cannon. The miners pitched their tents in the compound and cooked on the beach, while Tudor dined with Joan and Sheldon. Their guest seemed to have been everywhere and seen everything and met everybody, and encouraged by Joan, his talk was largely upon his own adventures. He was an adventurer of adventurers, and by his own account had been born into adventure. Descended from old New England stock, his father, a consul general, he had been born in Germany, in which country he had received his early education and his accent. Then, still a boy, he had rejoined his father in Turkey and accompanied him later to Persia, his father having been appointed minister to that country. Tudor had always been a wanderer, and with facile wit and quick vivid description, he leaped from episode and place to episode and place, relating his experiences seemingly not because they were his, but for the sake of their bizarreness and uniqueness, for the unusual incident or the laughable situation. He had gone through South American revolutions, been a rough rider in Cuba, a scout in South Africa, a war correspondent in the Russo-Japanese War. He had mushed dogs in the Klondike, washed gold from the sands of Nome and edited a newspaper in San Francisco. The President of the United States was his friend. He was equally at home in the clubs of London and the continent, the Grand Hotel at Yokohama, and the selectors' shanties in the Never Never country. He had shot big game in Siam, pearled in the Paumotus, visited Tolstoy, seen the Passion Play, and crossed the Andes on muleback while he was a living directory of the fever holes of West Africa. Sheldon leaned back in his chair on the veranda, sipping his coffee and listening. In spite of himself, he felt touched by the charm of the man who had led so varied a life. And yet Sheldon was not comfortable. It seemed to him that the man addressed himself particularly to Joan. His words and smiles were directed impartially toward both of them, yet Sheldon was certain, had the two men of them been alone, that the conversation would have been along different lines. Tudor had seen the effect on Joan and deliberately continued the flow of reminiscence, netting her in the glamour of romance. Sheldon watched her rapt attention, listened to her spontaneous laughter, quick questions and passing judgments, and felt grow within him the dawning consciousness that he loved her. So he was very quiet and almost sad, though at times he was aware of a distinct irritation against his guest, and he even speculated as to what percentage of Tudor's tale was true and how any of it could be proved or disproved. In this connection, as if the scene had been prepared by a clever playwright, Utami came upon the veranda to report to Joan the capture of a crocodile in the trap they had made for her. Tudor's face, illuminated by the match with which he was lighting his cigarette, caught Utami's eye, and Utami forgot to report to his mistress. "Hello, Tudor," he said, with a familiarity that startled Sheldon. The Polynesian's hand went out, and Tudor, shaking it, was staring into his face. "Who is it?" he asked. "I can't see you." "Utami." "And who the dickens is Utami? Where did I ever meet you, my man?" "You no forget the Huahine?" Utami chided. "Last time Huahine sail?" Tudor gripped the Tahitian's hand a second time and shook it with genuine heartiness. There was only one Kanaka who came out of the Huahine that last voyage, and that Kanaka was Joe. "The deuce take it, man. I'm glad to see you, though I never heard your new name before." "Yes, everybody speak me Joe along the Huahine. Utami my name all the time, just the same." "But what are you doing here?" Tudor asked, releasing the sailor's hand and leaning eagerly forward. "Me sail along Missy Lackalana her schooner Mealy. We go Tahiti, Raiatea, Tahia, Bora Bora, Manua, Tutuila, Apia, Savai'i, and Fiji Islands. Plenty Fiji Islands. Me stop along Missy Lackalana in Solomons. Very soon she catch other schooner. He and I were the two survivors of the wreck of the Huahine," Tudor explained to the others. 57 all told on board when we sailed from Huapa, and Joe and I were the only two that ever set foot on land again. Hurricane, you know, in the Paumotus. That was when I was after pearls." "And you never told me, Utami, that you'd been wrecked in a hurricane," Joan said reproachfully. The big Tahitian shifted his weight and flashed his teeth in a conciliating smile. "Me noting nothing at all," he said. He half-turned as if to depart, by his manner indicating that he considered it time to go, while yet he desired to remain. "All right, Utami," Tudor said. "I'll see you in the morning and have a yarn." "He saved my life, the beggar," Tudor explained, as the Tahitian strode away, and with heavy softness of foot, went down the steps. "Swim. I never met a better swimmer." And thereat, solicited by Joan, Tudor narrated the wreck of the Huahine, while Sheldon smoked and pondered, and decided that whatever the man's shortcomings were, he was at least not a liar. Chapter 15. A Discourse on Manners. The days passed, and Tudor seemed loath to leave the hospitality of Barrande. Everything was ready for the start, but he lingered on, spending much time in Joan's company, and thereby increasing the dislike Sheldon had taken to him. He went swimming with her, in point of rashness exceeding her, and dynamited fish with her, diving among the hungry ground sharks, and contesting with them for possession of the stunned prey until he earned the approval of the whole Tahitian crew. Arahu challenged him to tear a fish from a shark's jaws, leaving half to the shark and bringing the other half himself to the surface. And Tudor performed the feat, a flip from the sandpaper hide of the astonished shark, scraping several inches of skin from his shoulder. And Joan was delighted, while Sheldon, looking on, realized that here was the hero of her adventure dreams coming true. She did not care for love, but he felt that if ever she did love, it would be that sort of a man. A man who exhibited, was his way of putting it. He felt himself handicapped in the presence of Tudor, who had the gift of making a show of all his qualities. Sheldon knew himself for a brave man, wherefore he made no advertisement of the fact. He knew that just as readily as the other would he dive among ground sharks to save a life, but in that fact he could find no sanction for the foolhardy act of diving among sharks for the half of a fish. The difference between them was that he kept the curtain of his shop window down. Life pulsed steadily and deep in him, and it was not his nature needlessly to agitate the surface so that the world could see the splash he was making. And the effect of the other's amazing exhibitions was to make him retreat more deeply within himself and wrap himself more thickly than ever in the nerveless, stoical calm of his race. "You are so stupid the last few days," Joan complained to him. "One would think you were sick, or bilious, or something. You don't seem to have an idea in your head above black labor and coconuts. What is the matter?" Sheldon smiled and beat a further retreat within himself, listening the while to Joan and Tudor propounding the theory of the strong arm by which the white man ordered life among the lesser breeds. As he listened, Sheldon realized, as by revelation, that that was precisely what he was doing. While they philosophized about it, he was living it, placing the strong hand of his race firmly on the shoulders of the lesser breeds that labored on Barrande or menaced it from afar. But why talk about it? He asked himself. It was sufficient to do it and be done with it. He said as much, dryly and quietly, and found himself involved in a discussion with Joan and Tudor siding against him, in which a more astounding charge than ever he had dreamed of was made against the very English control and reserve, of which he was secretly proud. "The Yankees talk a lot about what they do and have done," Tudor said, "and are looked down upon by the English as braggarts. But the Yankee is only a child. He does not know effectually how to brag. He talks about it, you see. But the Englishman goes him one better by not talking about it. The Englishman's proverbial lack of bragging is a subtler form of brag after all. It is really clever, as you will agree." "I never thought of it before," Joan cried. "Of course, an Englishman performs some terrifically heroic exploit and is very modest and reserved, refuses to talk about it at all, and the effect is that by his silence he as much as says, 'I do things like this every day. It is as easy as rolling off a log. You ought to see the really heroic things I could do if they ever came my way. But this little thing, this little episode, really, don't you know, I fail to see anything in it remarkable or unusual. As for me, if I went up in a powder explosion or saved 100 lives, I'd want all my friends to hear about it, and their friends as well. I'd be prouder than Lucifer over the affair. Confess, Mr. Sheldon, don't you feel proud down inside when you've done something daring or courageous? Sheldon nodded. Then, she pressed home the point, isn't disguising that pride under a mask of careless indifference equivalent to telling a lie? Yes, it is, he admitted, but we tell similar lies every day. It is a matter of training, and the English are better trained, that is all. Your countrymen will be trained as well in time. As Mr. Tudor said, the Yankees are young. Thank goodness we haven't begun to tell such lies yet, was Joan's ejaculation. Oh, but you have, Sheldon said quickly. You were telling me a lie of that order only the other day. You remember when you were going up the lantern halyards hand over hand? Your face was the personification of duplicity. It was no such thing. Pardon me a moment, he went on. Your face was as calm and peaceful as though you were reclining in a steamer chair. To look at your face, one would have inferred that carrying the weight of your body up a rope hand over hand was a very commonplace accomplishment, as easy as rolling off a log. And you needn't tell me, Miss Lackland, that you didn't make faces the first time you tried to climb a rope. But like any circus athlete, you trained yourself out of the face-making period. You trained your face to hide your feelings, to hide the exhausting effort your muscles were making. It was, to quote Mr. Tudor, a subtler exhibition of physical prowess. And that is all our English reserve is, a mere matter of training. Certainly we are proud inside of the things we do and have done. Proud as Lucifer, yes, and prouder. But we have grown up and no longer talk about such things. I surrender, Joan cried. You are not so stupid after all. Yes, you have us there, Tudor admitted. But you wouldn't have had us if you hadn't broken your training rules. How do you mean? By talking about it. Joan clapped her hands in approval. Tudor lighted a fresh cigarette while Sheldon sat on, imperturbably silent. He got you there, Joan challenged. Why don't you crush him? Really, I can't think of anything to say, Sheldon said. I know my position is sound, and that is satisfactory enough. You might retort, she suggested, that when an adult is with kindergarten children, he must descend to kindergarten idioms in order to make himself intelligible. That was why you broke training rules. It was the only way to make us children understand. You've deserted in the heat of the battle, Miss Lackland, and gone over to the enemy, Tudor said, plaintively. But she was not listening. Instead, she was looking intently across the compound and out to sea. They followed her gaze and saw a green light and the loom of a vessel's sails. I wonder if it's the Martha come back, Tudor hazarded. No, the side light is too low, Joan answered. Besides, they've got the sweeps out. Don't you hear them? They wouldn't be sweeping a big vessel like the Martha. Besides, the Martha has a gasoline engine, 25 horsepower, Tudor added. Just the sort of a craft for us, Joan said, wistfully to Sheldon. I really must see if I can't get a schooner with an engine. I might get a second-hand engine put in. That would mean the additional expense of an engineer's wages, he objected. But it would pay for itself by quicker passages, she argued, and it would be as good as insurance. I know. I've knocked about amongst reefs myself. Besides, if you weren't so medieval, I could be skipper and save more than the engineer's wages. He did not reply to her thrust, and she glanced at him. He was looking out over the water, and in the lantern light she noted the lines of his face, strong, stern, dogged, the mouth almost chaste, but firmer and thinner-lipped than Tudor's. For the first time, she realized the quality of his strength, the calm and quiet of it, its simple integrity and reposeful determination. She glanced quickly at Tudor on the other side of her. It was a handsomer face, one that was more immediately pleasing, but she did not like the mouth. It was made for kissing, and she abhorred kisses. This was not a deliberately achieved concept. It came to her in the form of a faint and vaguely intangible repulsion. For the moment, she knew a fleeting doubt of the man. Perhaps Sheldon was right in his judgment of the other. She did not know, and it concerned her little, for boats and the sea and the things and happenings of the sea were of far more vital interest to her than men. And the next moment, she was staring through the warm, tropic darkness at the loom of the sails and the steady green of the moving sidelight, and listening eagerly to the click of the sweeps in the rowlocks. In her mind's eye, she could see the straining naked forms of black men bending rhythmically to the work, and somewhere on that strange deck she knew was the inevitable masterman, conning the vessel in to its anchorage, peering at the dim tree line of the shore, judging the deceitful night distances, feeling on his cheek the first fans of the land breeze that was even then beginning to blow, weighing, thinking, measuring, gauging the score or more of ever-shifting forces through which, by which, and in spite of which he directed the steady equilibrium of his course. She knew it because she loved it, and she was alive to it as only a sailor could be. Twice she heard the splash of the lid and listened intently for the cry that followed. Once a man's voice spoke, low, imperative, issuing an order, and she thrilled with the delight of it. It was only a direction to the man at the wheel to port his helm. She watched the slight altering of the course, and knew that it was for the purpose of enabling the flat-hauled sails to catch those first fans of the land breeze, and she waited for the same low voice to utter the one word, steady. And again she thrilled when it did utter it. Once more the lead splashed, and 11 fathom was the resulting cry. Let go! The low voice came to her through the darkness, followed by the surging rumble of the anchor chain. The clicking of the sheaves in the blocks as the sails ran down, head sails first, was music to her, and she detected on the instant the jamming of a jib-down haul, and almost saw the impatient jerk with which the sailor must have cleared it. Nor did she take interest in the 2 men beside her till both lights, red and green, came into view as the anchor checked the onward way. Sheldon was wondering as to the identity of the craft, while Tudor persisted in believing it might be the Martha. It's the Minerva, Joan said decidedly. How do you know? Sheldon asked, skeptical of her certitude. It's a ketch to begin with, and besides, I could tell anywhere the rattle of her main peak blocks. They're too large for the halyard. A dark figure crossed the compound diagonally from the beach gate, where whoever it was had been watching the vessel. Is that you, Utami? Joan called. No, missy, me Matapu, was the answer. What vessel is it? Me tink Minerva. Joan looked triumphantly at Sheldon, who bowed. If Matapu says so, it must be so, he murmured. But when Joan Lackland says so, you doubt, she cried, just as you doubt her ability as a skipper. But never mind, you'll be sorry some day for all your unkindness. There's the boat lowering now, and in 5 minutes we'll be shaking hands with Christian Young. Lalaperu brought out the glasses and cigarettes and the eternal whiskey and soda, and before the 5 minutes were past, the gate clicked, and Christian Young, tawny and golden, gentle, of voice and look and hand, came up the bungalow steps and joined them. Chapter 16. The Girl Who Had Not Grown Up. News as usual, Christian Young brought news of the drinking at Guvutu, where the men boasted that they drank between drinks, news of the new rifles adrift on Isabel, of the latest murders on Melita, of Tom Butler's sickness on Santa Ana, and last and most important, news that the Matambo had gone on a reef in the Shortlands and would be laid off one run for repairs. "That means 5 weeks more before you can sail for Sydney," Sheldon said to Joan. "And that we are losing precious time," she added ruefully. "If you want to go to Sydney, the Upolu sails from Tulagi tomorrow afternoon," Young said. "But I thought she was running recruits for the Germans in Samoa," she objected. "At any rate, I could catch her to Samoa and change at Apia to one of the Weir Line freighters. It's a long way around, but still, it would save time." "This time, the Upolu is going straight to Sydney," Young explained. "She's going to dry dock, you see, and you can catch her as late as 5 tomorrow afternoon. At least, so her first officer told me. But I've got to go to Gavutu first." Joan looked at the men with a whimsical expression. "I've some shopping to do. I can't wear these Barande curtains into Sydney. I must buy cloth at Gavutu and make myself a dress during the voyage down. I'll start immediately, in an hour. Lalaperu, you bring 'em one fella Adamu Adam along me. Tell 'em that fella Orn Fury make 'em Kai take along whaleboat." She rose to her feet, looking at Sheldon. "And you, please, have the boys carry down the whaleboat. My boat, you know. I'll be off in an hour." Both Sheldon and Tudor looked at their watches. "It's an all-night row," Sheldon said. "You might wait till morning." "And miss my shopping? No, thank you. Besides, the Upolu is not a regular passenger steamer, and she is just as liable to sail ahead of time as on time. And from what I hear about those Gavutu Sybarites, the best time to shop will be in the morning. And now you'll have to excuse me, for I've got to pack." "I'll go over with you," Sheldon announced. "Let me run you over in the Minerva," said Young. She shook her head laughingly. "I'm going in the whaleboat. One would think from all your solicitude that I'd never been away from home before. You, Mr. Sheldon, as my partner, I cannot permit to desert Barande and your work out of a mistaken notion of courtesy. If you won't permit me to be skipper, I won't permit your gallivanting over the sea as protector of young women who don't need protection. And as for you, Captain Young, you know very well that you just left Gavutu this morning, that you are bound for Marau, and that you said yourself that in 2 hours you are getting underway again." "But may I not see you safely across?" Tudor asked, a pleading note in his voice that rasped on Sheldon's nerves. "No, no, and again no," she cried. "You've all got your work to do, and so have I. I came to the Solomons to work, not to be escorted about like a doll. For that matter, here's my escort, and there are 7 more like him." Adamu Adam stood beside her, towering above her as he towered above the 3 white men. The clinging cotton undershirt he wore could not hide the bulge of his tremendous muscles. "Look at his fist," said Tudor. "I'd hate to receive a punch from it." "I don't blame you." Joan laughed reminiscently. "I saw him hit the captain of a Swedish bark on the beach at Levuka in the Fijis. It was the captain's fault. I saw it all myself, and it was splendid. Adamu only hit him once, and he broke the man's arm. You remember Adamu?" The big Tahitian smiled and nodded, his black eyes, soft and deer-like, seeming to give the lie to so belligerent a nature. "We start in an hour in the whaleboat for Gavutu, big brother," Joan said to him. "Tell your brothers, all of them, so that they can get ready. We catch the Upolu for Sydney. You will all come along, and sail back to the Solomons in the new schooner. Take your extra shirts and dungarees along. Plenty cold weather down there. Now run along, and tell them to hurry. Leave the guns behind. Turn them over to Mr. Sheldon. We won't need them." "If you are really bent upon going," Sheldon began. "That's settled long ago," she answered shortly. "I'm going to pack now, but I'll tell you what you can do for me. Issue some tobacco and other stuff they want to my men." An hour later, the three men had shaken hands with Joan down on the beach. She gave the signal, and the boat shoved off. 6 men at the oars, the 7th man forward, and Adamu Adam at the steering sweep. Joan was standing up in the stern sheets, reiterating her goodbyes, a slim figure of a woman in the tight-fitting jacket she had worn ashore from the wreck, the long-barreled Colt's revolver hanging from the loose belt around her waist, her clear-cut face like a boy's under the Stetson hat that failed to conceal the heavy masses of hair beneath. "You'd better get into shelter," she called to them. "There's a big squall coming, and I hope you've got plenty of chain out, Captain Young. Goodbye, goodbye, everybody." Her last words came out of the darkness, which wrapped itself solidly about the boat. Yet they continued to stare into the blackness in the direction in which the boat had disappeared, listening to the steady click of the oars in the rowlocks until it faded away and ceased. "She is only a girl," Christian Young said with slow solemnity. The discovery seemed to have been made on the spur of the moment. "She is only a girl," he repeated, with greater solemnity. "A dashed pretty one and a good traveller," Tudor laughed. "She certainly has spunk, eh, Sheldon?" "Yes, she is brave," was the reluctant answer, for Sheldon did not feel disposed to talk about her. "That's the American of it," Tudor went on. "Push and go and energy and independence. What do you think, Skipper?" "I think she is young, very young, only a girl," replied the captain of the Minerva, continuing to stare into the blackness that hid the sea. The blackness seemed suddenly to increase in density, and they stumbled up the beach, feeling their way to the gate. "Watch out for nuts," Sheldon warned as the first blast of the squall shrieked through the palms. They joined hands and staggered up the path, with the ripe coconuts thudding in a monstrous rain all around them. They gained the veranda, where they sat in silence over their whiskey, each man staring straight out to sea, where the wildly swinging riding light of the Minerva could be seen in the lulls of the driving rain. Somewhere out there, Sheldon reflected, was Joan Lackland, the girl who had not grown up, the woman good to look upon, with only a boy's mind and a boy's desires, leaving Barande amid storm and conflict in much the same manner that she had first arrived, in the stern sheets of her whaleboat, Adamu Adam steering, her savage crew bending to the oars. And she was taking her Stetson hat with her, along with the cartridge belt and the long-barreled revolver. He suddenly discovered an immense affection for those fripperies of hers, at which he had secretly laughed when first he saw them. He became aware of the sentimental direction in which his fancy was leading him, and felt inclined to laugh. But he did not laugh. The next moment he was busy visioning the hat and belt and revolver. Undoubtedly this was love, he thought, and he felt a tiny glow of pride in him, in that the Solomons had not succeeded in killing all his sentiment. An hour later, Christian Young stood up, knocked out his pipe, and prepared to go aboard and get under way. "She's all right," he said, apropos of nothing spoken, and yet distinctly relevant to what was in each of their minds. "She's got a good boat's crew, and she's a sailor herself. Good night, Mr. Sheldon. Anything I can do for you down Morale way?" He turned and pointed to a widening space of starry sky. "It's going to be a fine night after all. With this favouring bit of breeze, she has sail on already, and she'll make Gavutu by daylight. Good night." "I guess I'll turn in, old man," Tudor said, rising and placing his glass on the table. "I'll start the first thing in the morning. It's been disgraceful the way I've been hanging on here. Good night." Sheldon, sitting on alone, wondered if the other man would have decided to pull out in the morning Had Joan not sailed away? Well, there was one bit of consolation in it. Joan had certainly lingered at Baranda for no man, not even Tudor. "I start in an hour." Her words rang in his brain, and under his eyelids he could see her as she stood up and uttered them. He smiled. The instant she heard the news, she had made up her mind to go. It was not very flattering to man, but what could any man count in her eyes when a schooner waiting to be bought in Sydney was in the wind? What a creature! What a creature! Baranda was a lonely place to Sheldon in the days that followed. In the morning after Joan's departure, he had seen Tudor's expedition off on its way up the Balisuna. In the late afternoon, through his telescope, he had seen the smoke of the Upolu that was bearing Joan away to Sydney, and in the evening he sat down to dinner in solitary state, devoting more of his time to looking at her empty chair than to his food. He never came out on the veranda without glancing first of all at her grass house in the corner of the compound, and one evening, idly knocking the balls about on the billiard table, he came to himself to find himself standing, staring at the nail upon which from the first she had hung her Stetson hat and her revolver belt. Why should he care for her? He demanded of himself angrily. She was certainly the last woman in the world he would have thought of choosing for himself. Never had he encountered one who had so thoroughly irritated him, rasped his feelings, smashed his conventions, and violated nearly every attribute of what had been his ideal of woman. Had he been too long away from the world? Had he forgotten what the race of women was like? Was it merely a case of propinquity? And she wasn't really a woman. She was a masquerader. Under all her seeming of woman, she was a boy, playing a boy's pranks, diving for fish amongst sharks, sporting a revolver, longing for adventure, and what was more, going out in search of it in her whaleboat, along with her savage islanders and her bag of sovereigns. But he loved her. That was the point of it all, and he did not try to evade it. He was not sorry that it was so. He loved her. That was the overwhelming, astounding fact. Once again, he discovered a big enthusiasm for Barandi. All the bubble illusions concerning the life of the tropical planter had been pricked by the stern facts of the Solomons. Following the death of Huey, he had resolved to muddle along somehow with the plantation. But this resolve had not been based upon desire. Instead, it was based upon the inherent stubbornness of his nature and his dislike to give over an attempted task. But now, it was different. Baranda meant everything. It must succeed, not merely because Joan was a partner in it, but because he wanted to make that partnership permanently binding. 3 more years, and the plantation would be a splendid paying investment. They could then take yearly trips to Australia and oftener, and an occasional run home to England, or Hawaii would come as a matter of course. He spent his evenings poring over accounts or making endless calculations based on cheaper freights for copra and on the possible maximum and minimum market prices for that staple of commerce. His days were spent out on the plantation. He undertook more clearing of bush, and clearing and planting went on under his personal supervision, at a faster pace than ever before. He experimented with premiums for extra work performed by the black boys and yearned continually for more of them to put to work. Not until Joan could return on the schooner would this be possible, for the professional recruiters were all under long contracts to the Fulcrum brothers, Morgan and Raff, and the Fires, Philp Company, while the Flibberty-Gibbet was wholly occupied in running about among his widely scattered trading stations, which extended from the coast of New Georgia in one direction to Ulava and Sikiana in the other. Blacks he must have, and if Joan were fortunate in getting a schooner, 3 months at least must elapse before the first recruits could be landed on Barande. A week after the Upolu's departure, the Malakula dropped anchor and her skipper came ashore for a game of billiards and to gossip until the land breeze sprang up. Besides, as he told his supercargo, he simply had to come ashore, not merely to deliver the large package of seeds with full instructions for planting from Joan, but to shock Sheldon with the little surprise born of information he was bringing with him. Captain Auckland played the billiards first, and it was not until he was comfortably seated in a steamer chair, his second whiskey securely in his hand, that he let off his bomb. "A great piece, that Miss Lackland of yours," he chuckled. "Claims to be a part owner of Barandi. Says she's your partner. Is that straight?" Sheldon nodded coldly. "You don't say? That is a surprise. Well, she hasn't convinced Gavutu or Tulagi of it. They're pretty used to irregular things over there, but ha ha!" He stopped to have his laugh out and to mop his bald head with a trade handkerchief. But that partnership yarn of hers was too big to swallow, though it gave them the excuse for a few more drinks. "There is nothing irregular about it. It is an ordinary business transaction." Sheldon strove to act as though such transactions were quite the commonplace thing on plantations in the Solomons. "She invested something like £1,500 in Barandi, so she said, and she has gone to Sydney on business for the plantation." "Oh no, she hasn't." "I beg pardon?" Sheldon queried. "I said she hasn't, that's all." "But didn't the Upolu sail? I could have sworn I saw her smoke last Tuesday afternoon, late, as she passed Savo." "The Upolu sailed all right." Captain Auckland sipped his whiskey with provoking slowness. "Only Miss Lackland wasn't a passenger." "Then where is she?" "At Gavutu, last I saw of her. She was going to Sydney to buy a schooner, wasn't she?" Yes. That's what she said." "Well, she's bought one, though I wouldn't give her 10 shillings for it if a nor'wester blows up, and it's about time we had one. This has been too long a spell of good weather to last." "If you came here to excite my curiosity, old man," Sheldon said, "you've certainly succeeded. Now go ahead and tell me in a straightforward way what has happened. What schooner? Where is it? How did she happen to buy it?" "First, the schooner Martha," the skipper answered, checking his replies off on his fingers. "Second, the Martha is on the outside reef at Punga Punga, looted clean of everything portable and ready to go to pieces with the first bit of lively sea. And third, Miss Lackland bought her at auction. She was knocked down to her for 55 quid by the third assistant resident commissioner. I ought to know. I bid 50 myself, for Morgan and Raff. My word, weren't they hot? I told them to go to the devil, and that it was their fault for limiting me to 50 quid when they thought the chance to salve the Martha was worth more. You see, they weren't expecting competition. Fulcrum Brothers had no representative present, neither had Fires, Philp Company, and the only man to be afraid of was Nielsen's agent, Squires, and him they got drunk and sound asleep over in Gavutu. 20, says I, for my bid. 25, says the little girl. 30, says I. 40, says she. 50, says I. 55, says she, and there I was stuck. Hold on, says I, wait till I see my owners. No, you don't, says she. It's customary, says I. Not anywhere in the world, says she. Then it's courtesy in the Solomons, says I. And you know, on my faith, I think Burnett'd have done it, only she pipes up, sweet and pert as you please. Mr. Auctioneer, will you kindly proceed with the sale in the customary manner? I've other business to attend to, and I can't afford to wait all night on men who don't know their own minds. And then she smiles, at Burnett as well. You know, one of those fetching smiles. And damn if Burnett doesn't begin singing out, Goin', last bid, goin' for 55 sovereigns, goin', gone to you, Miss what name, please? Joan Lackland, says she, with a smile to me, and that's how she bought the Martha. Sheldon experienced a sudden thrill. The Martha, a finer schooner than the Malakula, and for that matter, the finest in the Solomons. She was just the thing for recruits, and she was right on the spot. Then he realized that for such a craft to sell at auction for £55 meant that there was small chance for saving her. But how did it happen? He asked. Weren't they rather quick in selling the Martha? Had to. You know the reef at Punga Punga. She's not worth tuppence on it if any kind of a sea kicks up, and it's ripe for a nor'wester any moment now. The crowd abandoned her completely. Didn't even dream of auctioning her. Morgan and Raff persuaded them to put her up. They're a cooperative crowd, you know, an organized business corporation, fore and aft, all hands, and the cook. They held a meeting and voted to sell. But why didn't they stand by and try to save her? Stand by. You know Malaita, and you know Punga Punga. That's where they cut off the Scottish chiefs and killed all hands. There was nothing to do but take to the boats. The Martha missed stays going in, and inside 5 minutes she was on the reef and in possession. The niggers swarmed over her, and they just threw the crew into the boats. I talked with some of the men. They swear there were 200 war canoes around her inside half an hour and 5,000 bushmen on the beach. Said you couldn't see Malaita for the smoke of the signal fires. Anyway, they cleared out for Tulagi. But why didn't they fight? Sheldon asked. It was funny they didn't, but they got separated. You see, 2/3 of them were in the boats, without weapons, running anchors, and never dreaming the natives would attack. They found out their mistake too late. The natives had charge. That's the trouble of new chums on the coast. It would never have happened with you or me or any old-timer. But what is Miss Lackland intending to do? Captain Auckland grinned. She's going to try to get the Martha off, I should say, or else why did she pay 55 quid for her? And if she fails, she'll try to get her money back by saving the gear, spars, you know, and patent steering gear, and winches and such things. At least that's what I'd do if I was in her place. When I sailed, the little girl had chartered the Emily. I'm going recruiting, says Munster. He's the skipper and owner now. And how much will you net on the cruise? Asks she. Oh, 50 quid, says he. Good, says she. You bring your Emily along with me, and you'll get 75. You know that big ship's anchor and chain piled up behind the coal sheds? She was just buying that when I left. She's certainly a hustler, that little girl of yours. She is my partner, Sheldon corrected. Well, she's a good one, that's all, and a cool one. My word. A white woman on Malaita, and at Punga Punga of all places. Oh, I forgot to tell you, she palavered Burnett into lending her 8 rifles for her men and 3 cases of dynamite. You'd laugh to see the way she makes that Gavutu gang stand around. And to see them being polite and trying to give advice. Lord, man, that little girl's a wonder, a marvel, a catastrophe. That's what she is, a catastrophe. She's gone through Gavutu and Tulagi like a hurricane. Every last swine of them in love with her. Except Raff. He saw over the auction, and he sprang his recruiting contract with Munster on her. And what does she do but thank him, and read it over, and point out that while Munster was pledged to deliver all recruits to Morgan and Raff, there was no clause in the document forbidding him from chartering the Emily. There's your contract, says she, passing it back. And a very good contract it is. The next time you draw one up, insert a clause that will fit emergencies like the present one. And Lord, she had him too. But there's the breeze, and I'm off. Goodbye, old man. Hope the little girl succeeds. The Martha's a whacking fine boat, and she'd take the place of the Jessie. Chapter 17. You're Miss Lackland. The next morning, Sheldon came in from the plantation to breakfast to find the mission ketch, Apostle, at anchor, her crew swimming 2 mares and a filly ashore. Sheldon recognized the animals as belonging to the resident commissioner, and he immediately wondered if Joan had bought them. She was certainly living up to her threat of rattling the dry bones of the Solomons, and he was prepared for anything. Miss Lackland sent them, said Welshmere, the missionary doctor, stepping ashore and shaking hands with him. There's also a box of saddles on board, and this letter from her, and the skipper of the Flibberty-Gibbet. The next moment, and before he could greet him, Olsen stepped from the boat and began. She's stolen the Flibberty, Mr. Sheldon. Run clean away with her. She's a wild one. She gave me the fever, brought it on by shock, and got me drunk as well. Rotten drunk. Dr. Welshmere laughed heartily. Nevertheless, she is not an unmitigated evil, your Miss Lackland. She's sworn 3 men off their drink, or, to the same purpose, shut off their whiskey. You know them, Brahms, Curtis, and Fowler. She shipped them on the Flibberty-Gibbet along with her. She's the skipper of the Flibberty now, Olsen broke in, and she'll wreck her as sure as God didn't make the Solomons. Dr. Welshmere tried to look shocked, but laughed again. She has quite a way with her, he said. I tried to back out of bringing the horses over, said I couldn't charge freight, that the Apostle was under a yacht license, that I was going around by Savo and the upper end of Guadalcanar, but it was no use. Bother the charge, said she. You take the horses like a good man, and when I float the Martha, I'll return the service some day. And bother your orders, said she to me, Olsen cried. I'm your boss now, said she, and you take your orders from me. Look at that load of ivory nuts, I said. Bother them, said she. I'm playing for something bigger than ivory nuts. We'll dump them overside as soon as we get underway. Sheldon put his hands to his ears. I don't know what has happened, and you are trying to tell me the tale backwards. Come up to the house and get in the shade and begin at the beginning. What I want to know, Olsen began when they were seated, is she your partner or ain't she? That's what I want to know. She is, Sheldon assured him. Well, who'd have believed it? Olsen glanced appealingly at Dr. Welshmere and back again at Sheldon. I've seen a few unlikely things in these Solomons, rats 2 feet long, butterflies the commissioner hunts with a shotgun, ear ornaments that would shame the devil, and head-hunting devils that make the devil look like an angel. I've seen them and got used to them, but this young woman of yours— Miss Lackland is my partner and part owner of Barandi, Sheldon interrupted. So she said, the irate skipper dashed on, but she had no papers to show for it. How was I to know? And then there was that load of ivory nuts, 8 tons of them. For heaven's sake, begin at the— Sheldon tried to interrupt. And then she's hired them drunken loafers, 3 of the worst scoundrels that ever disgraced the Solomons, 15 quid a month each. What do you think of that? And sailed away with them too. Phew. You might give me a drink. The missionary won't mind. I've been on his teetotal hooker 4 days now, and I'm perishing. Dr. Welshmere nodded in reply to Sheldon's look of inquiry, and via Bury was dispatched for the whiskey and siphons. It is evident, Captain Olsen, Sheldon remarked to that refreshed mariner, that Miss Lackland has run away with your boat. Now please give a plain statement of what occurred. Righto, here goes. I'd just come in on the Flibberty. She was on board before I dropped the hook, in that whaleboat of hers with her gang of Tahiti heathens that big Adamu Adam and the rest. Don't drop the anchor, Captain Olsen, she sang out. I want you to get under way for Punga Punga. I looked to see if she'd been drinking. What was I to think? I was rounding up at the time alongside the shoal, a ticklish place, head sails running down and losing way, so I says, "Excuse me, Miss Lackland," and yells, "Forward, let go." "You might have listened to me and saved yourself trouble," says she, climbing over the rail and squinting along forward and seeing the first shackle flip out and stop. "There's 15 fathom," says she. "You may as well turn your men to and heave up." And then we had it out. I didn't believe her. I didn't think you'd take her on as a partner, and I told her as much and wanted proof. She got high and mighty, and I told her I was old enough to be her grandfather and that I wouldn't take gammon from a chit like her. And then I ordered her off the flibberty. "Captain Olsen," she says, "sweet as you please. I've a few minutes to spare on you, and I've got some good whiskey over on the Emily. Come on along. Besides, I want your advice about this wrecking business. Everybody says you're a crackerjack sailor man." That's what she said, crackerjack. And I went, in her whaleboat, Adamu Adam steering, and looking as solemn as a funeral. On the way, she told me about the Martha, and how she'd bought her, and was going to float her. She said she'd chartered the Emily, and was sailing as soon as I could get the flibberty under way. It struck me that her gammon was reasonable enough, and I agreed to pull out for Barandi right-o and get your orders to go along to Punga Punga, but she said there wasn't a second to be lost by any such foolishness, and that I was to sail direct for Punga Punga, and that if I couldn't take her word that she was your partner, she'd get along without me and the flibberty. And right there's where she fooled me. Down in the Emily's cabin was them 3 soaks. You know them. Fowler and Curtis and that Brahms chap. "Have a drink," says she. I thought they looked surprised when she unlocked the whiskey locker and sent a nigger for the glasses and water monkey. But she must have tipped them off unbeknownst to me, and they knew just what to do. "Excuse me," she says. "I'm going on deck a minute." Now that minute was half an hour. I hadn't had a drink in 10 days. I'm an old man, and the fever has weakened me. Then I took it on an empty stomach too, and there was them 3 soaks setting me an example. They arguing for me to take the flibberty to Punga Punga, and me pointing out my duty to the contrary. The trouble was, all the arguments were pointed with drinks, and me not being a drinking man, so to say, and weak from fever. Well, anyway, at the end of the half-hour down, she came again and took a good squint at me. "That'll do nicely," I remember her saying, and with that, she took the whiskey bottles and hove them overside through the companionway. "That's the last," she said to the 3 soaks, "till the Martha floats and you're back in Guvutu. It'll be a long time between drinks." And then she laughed. She looked at me and said, not to me, mind you, but to the soaks, "It's time this worthy man went ashore." Me, worthy man. "Fowler," she said, "you know, just like a straight order, and she didn't mister him. It was plain Fowler." "Fowler," she said, "just tell Adamu Adam to man the whaleboat, and while he's taking Captain Olsen ashore, have your boat put me on the flibberty. The 3 of you sail with me, so pack your dunnage, and the one of you that shows up best will take the mate's billet. Captain Olsen doesn't carry a mate, you know." I don't remember much after that. All hands got me over the side, and it seems to me I went to sleep, sitting in the stern sheets and watching that Adamu steer. Then I saw the flibberty's mainsail hoisting and heard the clank of her chain coming in, and I woke up. "Here, put me on the flibberty," I said to Adamu. "I put you on the beach," said he. "Missy Lackalana say beach plenty good for you." Well, I let out a yell and reached for the steering sweep. I was doing my best by my owners, you see, only that Adamu gives me a shove down on the bottom boards, puts one foot on me to hold me down, and goes on steering. And that's all. The shock of the whole thing brought on fever. And now I've come to find out whether I'm skipper of the Flibberty or that chit of yours with her pirating heathen boat's crew. Never mind, skipper. You can take a vacation on pay. Sheldon spoke with more assurance than he felt. If Miss Lackland, who is my partner, has seen fit to take charge of the Flibberty Gibbet, why, it is all right. As you will agree, there was no time to be lost if the Martha was to be got off. It is a bad reef, and any considerable sea would knock her bottom out. You settle down here, skipper, and rest up and get the fever out of your bones. When the Flibberty Gibbet comes back, you'll take charge again, of course. After Dr. Welshmere and the Apostle departed, and Captain Olson had turned in for a sleep in a veranda hammock, Sheldon opened Joan's letter. Dear Mr. Sheldon, please forgive me for stealing the Flibberty Gibbet. I simply had to. The Martha means everything to us. Think of it. Only £55 for her. $275. If I don't save her, I know I shall be able to pay all expenses out of her gear, which the natives will not have carried off. And if I do save her, it is the haul of a lifetime. And if I don't save her, I'll fill the Emily and the Flibberty Gibbet with recruits. Recruits are needed right now, on Barandi, more than anything else. And please, please don't be angry with me. You said I shouldn't go recruiting on the Flibberty, and I won't. I'll go on the Emily. I bought 2 cows this afternoon. That trader at Nogi died of fever, and I bought them from his partner, Sam Willis his name is, who agrees to deliver them, most likely by the Minerva, next time she is down that way. Barande has been long enough on tinned milk, and Dr. Welshmere has agreed to get me some orange and lime trees from the mission station at Ulava. He will deliver them the next trip of the Apostle. If the Sydney steamer arrives before I get back, plant the sweet corn she will bring between the young trees on the high bank of the Balasuna. The current is eating in against that bank, and you should do something to save it. I have ordered some fig trees and loquats too from Sydney. Dr. Welshmere will bring some mango seeds. They are big trees and require plenty of room. The Martha is registered 110 tons. She is the biggest schooner in the Solomons and the best. I saw a little of her lines and guessed the rest. She will sail like a witch. If she hasn't filled with water, her engine will be all right. The reason she went ashore was because it was not working. The engineer had disconnected the feed pipes to clean out the rust. Poor business, unless at anchor or with plenty of sea room. Plant all the trees in the compound, even if you have to clean out the palms later on. And don't plant the sweet corn all at once. Let a few days elapse between plantings. Joan Lackland. He fingered the letter, lingering over it and scrutinizing the writing in a way that was not his wont. How characteristic, was his thought, as he studied the boyish scrawl. Clear to read, painfully clear, but nonetheless boyish. The clearness of it reminded him of her face, of her cleanly stenciled brows, her straightly chiseled nose, the very clearness of the gaze of her eyes, the firmly yet delicately molded lips, and the throat, neither fragile nor robust, but just right, he concluded, an adequate and beautiful pillar for so shapely a burden. He looked long at the name. Joan Lackland, just an assemblage of letters, of commonplace letters, but an assemblage that generated a subtle and heady magic. It crept into his brain and twined and twisted his mental processes until all that constituted him at that moment went out in love to that scrawled signature. A few commonplace letters, yet they caused him to know in himself a lack that sweetly hurt and that expressed itself in vague spiritual outpourings and delicious yearnings. Joan Lackland. Each time he looked at it, there arose visions of her in a myriad moods and guises, coming in out of the flying smother of the gale that had wrecked her schooner, launching a whaleboat to go a-fishing, running dripping from the sea, with streaming hair and clinging garments, to the freshwater shower, frightening fourscore cannibals with an empty chlorodyne bottle, teaching Ornfiery how to make bread, hanging her Stetson hat and revolver belt on the hook in the living room, talking gravely about winning to hearth and saddle of her own, or juvenilely rattling on about romance and adventure. Bright-eyed, her face flushed and eager with enthusiasm. Joan Lackland, he mused over the cryptic wonder of it till the secrets of love were made clear, and he felt a keen sympathy for lovers who carved their names on trees or wrote them on the beach sands of the sea. Then he came back to reality, and his face hardened. Even then, she was on the wild coast of Malaita, and at Punga Punga, of all villainous and dangerous portions, the worst, peopled with a teeming population of headhunters, robbers, and murderers. For the instant, he entertained the rash thought of calling his boat's crew and starting immediately in a whaleboat for Punga Punga. But the next instant, the idea was dismissed. What could he do if he did go? First, she would resent it. Next, she would laugh at him and call him a silly. And after all, he would count for only one rifle more, and she had many rifles with her. 3 things only could he do if he went. He could command her to return. He could take the flibberty-gibbet away from her. He could dissolve their partnership, any and all of which he knew would be foolish and futile, and he could hear her explain in terse, set terms that she was legally of age, and that nobody could say come or go to her. No, his pride would never permit him to start for Punga Punga, though his heart whispered that nothing could be more welcome than a message from her asking him to come and lend a hand. Her very words, lend a hand, and in his fancy, he could see and hear her saying them. There was much in her willful conduct that caused him to wince in the heart of him. He was appalled by the thought of her shoulder to shoulder with the drunken rabble of traders and beachcombers at Gavutu. It was bad enough for a clean, fastidious man, but for a young woman, a girl at that, it was awful. The theft of the flibberty-gibbet was merely amusing, though the means by which the theft had been effected gave him hurt. Yet he found consolation in the fact that the task of making Olsen drunk had been turned over to the 3 scoundrels. And next, and swiftly, came the vision of her, alone with those same 3 scoundrels, on the Emily, sailing out to sea from Gavutu in the twilight, with darkness coming on. Then came visions of Adamu Adam and Noah Noah and all her brawny Tahitian following, and his anxiety faded away, being replaced by irritation that she should have been capable of such wildness of conduct. And the irritation was still on him as he got up and went inside to stare at the hook on the wall and to wish that her Stetson hat and revolver belt were hanging from it. Chapter 18. Making the Books Come True. Several quiet weeks slipped by. Barande, after such an unusual run of visiting vessels, drifted back into her old solitude. Sheldon went on with the daily round, clearing bush, planting coconuts, smoking copra, building bridges, and riding about his work on the horses Joan had bought. News of her he had none. Recruiting vessels on Malaita left the Punga Punga coast severely alone, and the clansman, a Samoan recruiter, dropping anchor one sunset for billiards and gossip, reported rumors amongst the CO natives that there had been fighting at Punga Punga. As this news would have had to travel right across the big island, little dependence was to be placed on it. The steamer from Sydney, the Kamambo, broke the quietude of Barande for an hour, while landing mail, supplies, and the trees and seeds Joan had ordered. The Minerva, bound for Cape Marsh, brought the 2 cows from Nogi, and the Apostle, hurrying back to Tulagi to connect with the Sydney steamer, sent a boat ashore with the orange and lime trees from Ulava, and these several weeks marked a period of perfect weather. There were days on end when sleek calms ruled the breathless sea, and days when vagrant wisps of air fanned for several hours from one direction or another. The land breezes at night alone proved regular, and it was at night that the occasional cutters and ketches slipped by, too eager to take advantage of the light winds to drop anchor for an hour. Then came the long-expected nor'wester. For 8 days it raged, lulling at times to short durations of calm, then shifting a point or two and raging with renewed violence. Sheldon kept a precautionary eye on the buildings, while the Balisuna, in flood, so savagely attacked the high bank Joan had warned him about, that he told off all the gangs to battle with the river. It was in the good weather that followed that he left the blacks at work one morning, and with a shotgun across his pommel, rode off after pigeons. 2 hours later, one of the houseboys, breathless and scratched, ran him down with the news that the Martha, the Flibberty-Gibbet, and the Emily were heading in for the anchorage. Coming into the compound from the rear, Sheldon could see nothing until he rode around the corner of the bungalow. Then he saw everything at once. First, a glimpse at the sea, where the Martha floated huge alongside the cutter and the ketch which had rescued her, and next the ground in front of the veranda steps, where a great crowd of fresh-caught cannibals stood at attention. From the fact that each was attired in a new snow-white lava, Sheldon knew that they were recruits. Part way up the steps, one of them was just backing down into the crowd, while another, called out by name, was coming up. It was Joan's voice that had called him, and Sheldon reined in his horse and watched. She sat at the head of the steps, behind a table, between Munster and his white mate, the 3 of them checking long lists, Joan asking the questions and writing the answers in the big, red-covered Barandi Labour Journal. "What name?" she demanded of the black man on the steps. "Tagari," came the answer, accompanied by a grin and a rolling of curious eyes, for it was the first white man's house the black had ever seen. "What place belong you?" "Bangura." No one had noticed Sheldon, and he continued to sit his horse and watch. There was a discrepancy between the answer and the record in the recruiting books, and a consequent discussion, until Munster solved the difficulty. "Bangura," he said. "That's the little beach at the head of the bay out of Latta. He's down as a Latta man. See, there it is. Tagari Latta." "What place you go, you finish along White Master?" Joan asked. "Bangura," the man replied, and Joan wrote it down. "Ogu," Joan called. The black stepped down, and another mounted to take his place. But Tagari, just before he reached the bottom step, caught sight of Sheldon. It was the first horse the fellow had ever seen, and he let out a frightened screech and dashed madly up the steps. At the same moment, the great mass of blacks surged away, panic-stricken, from Sheldon's vicinity. The grinning houseboys shouted encouragement and explanation, and the stampede was checked. The new-caught headhunters huddling closely together and staring dubiously at the fearful monster. "Hello," Joan called out. "What do you mean by frightening all my boys? Come on up." "What do you think of them?" she asked when they had shaken hands. "And what do you think of her?" with a wave of the hand toward the Martha. "I thought you'd deserted the plantation, and that I might as well go ahead and get the men into barracks. Aren't they beauties? Do you see that one with the split nose. He's the only man who doesn't hail from the Punga Punga coast. And they said the Punga Punga natives wouldn't recruit. Just look at them and congratulate me. There are no kiddies and half-grown youths among them. They're men, every last one of them. I have such a long story, I don't know where to begin, and I won't begin anyway till we're through with this, and until you have told me that you are not angry with me. Og, what place belong you? She went on with her catechism. But Ogu was a bushman, lacking knowledge of the almost universal bêche de mer English, and half a dozen of his fellows wrangled to explain. There are only 2 or 3 more, Jones said to Sheldon, and then we're done, but you haven't told me that you are not angry. Sheldon looked into her clear eyes as she favored him with a direct, untroubled gaze that threatened, he knew from experience, to turn teasingly defiant on an instant's notice. And as he looked at her, it came to him that he had never half anticipated the gladness her return would bring to him. I was angry, he said deliberately. I am still angry, very angry. He noted the glint of defiance in her eyes and thrilled. But I forgave, and I now forgive all over again, though I still insist that I should have a guardian, she interrupted. But that day will never come. Thank goodness I'm of legal age and able to transact business in my own right. And speaking of business, how do you like my forceful American methods? Mr. Raff, from what I hear, doesn't take kindly to them, he temporized, and you've certainly set the dry bones rattling for many a day. But what I want to know is if other American women are as successful in business ventures. Luck, most all luck, she disclaimed modestly, though her eyes lighted with sudden pleasure. And he knew her boy's vanity had been touched by his trifle of tempered praise. Luck be blowed, broke out the long-mate Sparrowhawk, his face shining with admiration. It was hard work, that's what it was. We earned our pay. She worked us till we dropped, and we were down with fever half the time. So was she, for that matter, only she wouldn't stay down, and she wouldn't let us stay down. My word, she's a slave driver. Just one more heave, Mr. Sparrowhawk, and then you can go to bed for a week. She to me, and me staggering round like a dead man with bilious green lights flashing inside my head, and my head just bustin'. I was all in, but I gave that heave right and then it was. Another heave now, Mr. Sparrowhawk, just another heave. And the Lord lummy, the way she made love to old Keena Kina. He shook his head reproachfully, while the laughter died down in his throat to long-drawn chuckles. He was older than Telepass and dirtier, she assured Sheldon, and I am sure much wickeder. But this isn't work. Let us get through with these lists. She turned to the waiting black on the steps. Ogu, you finish along big master belong white man. You go not. Here you Tangari, you speak along that fella Ogu. He finish he walk about not. Have you got that, Mr. Munster? But you've broken the recruiting laws, Sheldon said, when the new recruits had marched away to the barracks. The licenses for the Flibberty and the Emily don't allow for 150. What did Burnett say? He passed them, all of them, she answered. Captain Munster will tell you what he said. Something about being blowed, or words to that effect. Now I must run and wash up. Did the Sydney orders arrive? Yours are in your quarters, Sheldon said. Hurry, for breakfast is waiting. Let me have your hat and belt. Do, please, allow me. There's only one hook for them, and I know where it is. She gave him a quick scrutiny that was almost womanlike, then sighed with relief as she unbuckled the heavy belt and passed it to him. I doubt if I ever want to see another revolver, she complained. That one has worn a hole in me, I'm sure. I never dreamed I could get so weary of one. Sheldon watched her to the foot of the steps, where she turned and called back, "My, I can't tell you how good it is to be home again." And as his gaze continued to follow her across the compound to the tiny grass house, the realization came to him crushingly that Miranda and that little grass house was the only place in the world she could call home. And Burnett said, "Well, I'll be damned. I beg your pardon, Miss Lackland, but you have wantonly broken the recruiting laws, and you know it," Captain Munster narrated as they sat over their whiskey, waiting for Joan to come back. And says she to him, "Mr. Burnett, can you show me any law against taking the passengers off a vessel that's on a reef?" "That is not the point," says he. "It's the very precise, particular point," says she, "and you bear it in mind and go ahead and pass my recruits. You can report me to the Lord High Commissioner if you want, but I have 3 vessels here waiting on your convenience, and if you delay them much longer, there'll be another report go in to the Lord High Commissioner. I'll hold you responsible, Captain Munster," says he, to me, mad enough to eat scrap iron. "No, you won't," says she. "I'm the charterer of the Emily, and Captain Munster has acted under my orders." What could Burnett do? He passed the whole 150, though the Emily was only licensed for 40, and the Flibberty-Gibbet for 35. "But I don't understand," Sheldon said. "This is the way she worked it. When the Martha was floated, we had to beach her right away at the head of the bay, and whilst repairs were going on, a new rudder being made, sails bent, gear recovered from the niggers and so forth, Miss Lackland borrows Sparrowhawk to run the Flibberty along with Curtis, lends me Brahms to take Sparrowhawk's place, and starts both craft off recruiting. My word, the niggers came easy. It was virgin ground. Since the Scottish chiefs, no recruiter had ever even tried to work the coast, and we'd already put the fear of God into the niggers' hearts, till the whole coast was quiet as lambs. When we filled up, we came back to see how the Martha was progressing. And thinking we was going home with our recruits, Sparrowhawk slipped in. Lord Lummy, that Miss Lackland ain't never satisfied. I'll take him on the Martha, says she, and you can go back and fill up again. But I told her it couldn't be done, Munster went on. I told her the Martha hadn't a license for recruiting. Oh, she said, it can't be done, eh? And she stood and thought a few minutes. And I'd seen her think before, cried Sparrowhawk, and I knew at once that the thing was as good as done. Munster lighted his cigarette and resumed. You see that spit, she says to me, with the little ripple breaking around it? There's a current sets right across it and on it, and you see them baffling little cat's paws. It's good weather and a falling tide. You just start to beat out the two of you, and all you have to do is miss stays in the same baffling puff, and the current will set you nicely aground. That little wash of sea won't more than start a sheet or two of copper, says she, when Munster kicked, Sparrowhawk explained. Oh, she's no greener'n that girl. Then I'll rescue your recruits and sail away. Simple, ain't it? Says she, Munster continued. You hang up one tide, says she. The next is the big high water. Then you kedge off and go after more recruits. There's no law against recruiting when you're empty. But there is against starving 'em, I said. You know yourself, there ain't any kai-kai to speak of aboard of us, and there ain't a crumb on the Martha. We'd all been pretty well on native kai-kai, as it was, said Sparrowhawk. Don't let the kai-kai worry you, Captain Munster, says she. If I can find grub for 84 mouths on the Martha, the two of you can do as much by your 2 vessels. Now go ahead and get aground before a steady breeze comes up and spoils the maneuver. I'll send my boats the moment you strike. And now, good day, gentlemen. And we went and did it, Sparrowhawk said solemnly, and then emitted a series of chuckling noises. We laid over, starboard tack, and I pinched the Emily against the spit. "Go about," Captain Munster yells at me. "Go about, or you'll have me aground." He yelled other things, much worse. But I didn't mind. I missed stays, pretty as you please, and the Flibberty drifted down on him and fouled him, and we went ashore together in as nice a mess as you ever want to see. Miss Lackland transferred the recruits, and the trick was done. "But where was she during the nor'wester?" Sheldon asked. "At Langa Langa, ran up there as it was coming on, and laid there the whole week, and traded for grub with the niggers. When we got to Tulagi, there she was waiting for us, and scrapping with Burnett. I tell you, Mr. Sheldon, she's a wonder, that girl, a perfect wonder." Munster refilled his glass, and while Sheldon glanced across at Joan's house, anxious for her coming, Sparrowhawk took up the tale. "Gritty. She's the grittiest thing, man or woman, that ever blew into the Solomons. You should have seen Punga Punga the morning we arrived. Sniders popping on the beach and in the mangroves, war drums booming in the bush, and signal smokes raising everywhere." "It's all up," says Captain Munster. "Yes, that's what I said," declared that mariner. "Of course it was all up. You could see it with half an eye and hear it with one ear." "Up your granny," she says to him, Sparrowhawk went on. "Why, we haven't arrived yet, much less got started. Wait till the anchor's down before you get afraid." "That's what she said to me," Munster proclaimed. "And of course it made me mad, so that I didn't care what happened. We tried to send a boat ashore for a powwow, but it was fired upon, and every once in a while some nigger'd take a long shot at us out of the mangroves." "They was only a quarter of a mile off," Sparrowhawk explained, "and it was damned nasty. 'Don't shoot unless they try to board,' was Miss Lackland's orders, but the dirty niggers wouldn't board. They just lay off in the bush and plugged away. That night we held a council of war in the Flibberty's cabin. 'What we want,' says Miss Lackland, 'is a hostage.'" "That's what they do in books," I said, thinking to laugh her away from her folly. Munster interrupted. "True," says she, "and have you never seen the books come true?" I shook my head. "Then you're not too old to learn," says she. "I'll tell you one thing right now," says I, "and that is, I'll be blowed if you catch me ashore in the night time stealing niggers in a place like this." "You didn't say blowed," Sparrowhawk corrected. "You said you'd be damned." "That's what I did, and I meant it too." "Nobody asked you to go ashore," says she, quick as lightning. Sparrowhawk grinned, and she said more. She said, "And if I catch you going ashore without orders, there'll be trouble. Understand, Captain Munster?" "Who in hell's telling this, you or me?" the skipper demanded wrathfully. "Well, she did, didn't she?" insisted the mate. "Yes, she did, if you want to make so sure of it. And while you're about it, you might as well repeat what she said to you when you said you wouldn't recruit on the Punga Punga coast for twice your screw." Sparrowhawk's sun-reddened face flamed redder, though he tried to pass the situation off by divers laughings and chucklings and face-twistings. Go on," Sheldon urged, and Munster resumed the narrative. "What we need," says she, "is the strong hand. It's the only way to handle them, and we've got to take hold firm right at the beginning. I'm going ashore tonight to fetch Kina himself on board, and I'm not asking whose game to go for. I've got every man's work arranged with me for him. I'm taking my sailors with me and one white man." "Of course I'm that white man," I said, for by that time I was mad enough to go to hell and back again. "Of course you're not," says she. "You'll have charge of the covering boat. Curtis stands by the landing boat. Fowler goes with me. Brahms takes charge of the Flibberty and Sparrowhawk of the Emily, and we start at 1 o'clock. My word, it was a tough job lying there in the covering boat. I never thought doing nothing could be such hard work. We stopped about 50 fathoms off and watched the other boat go in. It was so dark under the mangroves, we couldn't see a thing of it. Do you know that little monkey-looking nigger, Sheldon? On the Flibberty. The cook, I mean. Well, he was cabin boy 20 years ago on the Scottish Chiefs, and after she was cut off, he was a slave there at Punga Punga. And Miss Lackland had discovered the fact. So, he was the guide. She gave him half a case of tobacco for that night's work, and scared him fit to die before she could get him to come along, Sparrowhawk observed. Well, I never saw anything so black as the mangroves. I stared at them till my eyes were ready to burst, and then I'd look at the stars and listen to the surf sighing along the reef. And there was a dog that barked. Remember that dog, Sparrowhawk? The brute nearly gave me heart failure when he first began. After a while, he stopped, wasn't barking at the landing party at all, and then the silence was harder than ever, and the mangroves grew blacker, and it was all I could do to keep from calling out to Curtis in there in the landing boat, just to make sure that I wasn't the only white man left alive. Of course there was a row. It had to come, and I knew it, but it startled me just the same. I never heard such screeching and yelling in my life. The niggers must have just dived for the bush without looking to see what was up, while her Tahitians let loose, shooting in the air and yelling to hurry 'em on. And then, just as sudden, came the silence again, all except for some small kiddie that had got dropped in the stampede and that kept crying in the bush for its mother. And then I heard them coming through the mangroves and an oar strike on a gunwale and Miss Lackland laugh, and I knew everything was all right. We pulled on board without a shot being fired. And by God, she had made the books come true, for there was old Keena Keena himself being hoisted over the rail, shivering and chattering like an ape. The rest was easy. Keena Keena's word was law, and he was scared to death. And we kept him on board, issuing proclamations all the time we were in Punga Punga. It was a good move, too, in other ways. She made Keena Keena order his people to return all the gear they'd stripped from the Martha. And back it came, day after day, steering compasses, blocks and tackles, sails, coils of rope, medicine chests, ensigns, signal flags, everything, in fact, except the trade goods and supplies which had already been kai'd. Of course, she gave them a few sticks of tobacco to keep them in good humor. Sure she did, Sparrowhawk broke forth. She gave the beggars 5 fathoms of calico for the big mainsail, 2 sticks of tobacco for the chronometer, and a sheath knife worth 11 pence halfpenny for 100 fathoms of brand-new 5-inch manila. She got old Keena Keena with that strong hand on the go-off, and she kept him going all the time. Here she comes now. It was with a shock of surprise that Sheldon greeted her appearance. All the time, while the tale of happening at Punga Punga had been going on, he had pictured her as the woman he had always known, clad roughly, skirt made out of window curtain stuff, an undersized man's shirt for a blouse, straw sandals for foot covering, with the Stetson hat and the eternal revolver completing her costume. The ready-made clothes from Sydney had transformed her. A simple skirt and shirt-waist of some sort of wash goods set off her trim figure with a hint of elegant womanhood that was new to him. Brown slippers peeped out as she crossed the compound, and he once caught a glimpse to the ankle of brown open-work stockings. Somehow, she had been made many times the woman by these mere extraneous trappings, and in his mind, these wild Arabian Nights adventures of hers seemed thrice as wonderful. As they went in to breakfast, he became aware that Munster and Sparrowhawk had received a similar shock. All their air of camaraderie was dissipated, and they had become abruptly and immensely respectful. "I've opened up a new field," she said, as she began pouring the coffee. "Old Kina Kina will never forget me, I'm sure, and I can recruit there whenever I want. I saw Morgan at Gavutu. He's willing to contract for 1,000 boys at 40 shillings per head. Did I tell you that I'd taken out a recruiting license for the Martha? I did, and the Martha can sign 80 boys every trip." Sheldon smiled a trifle bitterly to himself. The wonderful woman who had tripped across the compound in her Sydney clothes was gone, and he was listening to the boy come back again.